Okay, good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Grant. I'm the researcher for SAFTU. Just briefly, labor, climate change, and the just transition. It's a very, very important topic that's facing, well, everyone in the world right now, and everyone's got their positions. So in this workshop, we're going to be exploring some of the various important topics, like climate change itself, what a deep, just transition might be, what's happening with Eskom in this country, and all of the questions around that. And then we'll also be going into more of what's happening on the trade union side in our last panel. Greetings to everyone again, and thank you for joining. I would like to hand over to Comrade General Secretary Zwelinzima Vavi, who will just introduce us to the political school. Comrade, yes, floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning to the fellow panelists, and good morning to all of the comrades from the NSC who have joined. And I see that a lot of people have joined. We're quite excited that through this partnership, we're going to confront many challenges we face in the working class, and we face as communities, and we face as society of South Africa. Today, we are looking at the whole question of energy, and we're looking at the issue of climate change, and we're looking at the issue of just transition. These are very critical issues, big, big challenges that are facing our society at this particular moment. You will know that we've always had a company created during the apartheid era called Eskom, a national company, a state company that has historically been providing electricity, energy, very cheap, very accessible, in particular to the white community, and which was used by the apartheid regime in particular in the period between 1932 and for 12 years to address the crisis or the challenge of industrializing in South Africa. And it became a driver of that industrializing strategy of the apartheid regime. Many jobs were created, and somehow even those like the Black people suddenly became beneficiaries of that massive drive that saw the longest sustained economic growth in the history of South Africa. And it was that period driven amongst others by very cheap electricity of Eskom that saw the industrial base, the manufacturing base of the country moving to the point that by the dawn of democracy, the manufacturing sector was contributing more than 20% to our GDP. We're now sitting here 27 years down the line. All of us know what have happened. It's a tragedy. And all of us are in this school to grapple with the crisis that we are facing. Electricity prices have increased almost more than 300% over the past 15 years. Because right at the beginning, the new democratic government, inspired by what the previous regimes would have begun to do as they were restructuring the economy in anticipation of a big takeover by the Black government, they began to commercialize. And so Eskom was one of those companies that were commercialized. Commercializing means that you suddenly run companies and not to provide services, but to generate profit for the shareholder. And in this particular case, the shareholder had decided to cut the corporate taxes and to allow companies to move their listings outside and to remove all of the speed bumps that it would have used to trap resources inside the country in order to develop. And suddenly, before we know it, we have lost our competitive advantage of providing the cheapest electricity in the world. Eskom began to build. Eskom senior management would have told the government way back in 1997, at the dawn of the new era, that unless it was going to refurbish its infrastructure, invest again heavily to sustain and to guarantee the sustainable contribution of Eskom in the economy, we were going to run into trouble in 10 years. The Mbeki was effectively the president. Thabo Mbeki, the former president, was effectively the president whilst he was still the deputy president. Because they were eyeing Eskom for privatization, they ignored that. And in 10 years indeed, we started to see a phenomenon we've never experienced of load shedding, of bleeding of senior executive and skills, and of incapacity, and which have now created a situation where Eskom, outside the coronavirus pandemic restrictions, has become one of the biggest stumbling blocks to growth of the economy, to sustainable livelihoods for our communities. And this is absolutely regrettable. So this workshop comes in the context of all of that, where now we're talking about a government that is clearly driving towards the privatization of Eskom. It has introduced the independent power producers. It has allowed private companies to generate their own electricity, and in a manner that is going to undermine the position that Eskom has always enjoyed. It is allowing even the municipalities to generate their own electricity. And mind you, as we have repeatedly said from SAFTU, it is even allowing those independent power producers to be subsidized by Eskom. I've never seen something that looks like somebody protecting his company by asking other companies from elsewhere in the world to come and compete, but at the expense of the company that this state is supposed to be owning. This is just a summary of the issues that you're going to hear from our brilliant panelists who are going to be making the presentations today. And I don't know whether it is going to be you, Sikho, who will put up the program that we're going to follow today, so that all of us, we can then, on that basis, pursue a discussion on the basis of the inputs that we would have been provided by the panelists. And all of the panelists is not people that have to agree with SAFTU on each and every aspect of our issues and demands, but they will bring in all different angles, and for us to learn and something new to sharpen our policies going forward, but more importantly, to begin to campaign on the issue of climate change and just transition. I'm sure when the president of SAFTU will speak, you will hear how this government is just steaming ahead, and with sectoralized just transitions for Eskom, for Sasol, and for everybody. We're clearly in an era of a completely uncoordinated response to the crisis of climate change. And yet we know, comrade, that climate change is here. We were just looking yesterday on the forecast of what we're going to see in terms of the temperatures in Durban. We're going to be hitting possibly 40 degrees in Durban. 40 degrees. I don't know how many people with high blood pressure and other chronic diseases are going to end up dying there. You know what we have been coping with. We have been coping with rain bombs coming from Mozambique that have displaced hundreds and thousands of people into Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and suddenly South Africa on its way to the east coast of the country. So we are being devastated by unprecedented levels of climate change that have profound impact on the lives of ordinary people in this country. So this workshop today, we're going to dig deeper into the details of what that climate change has meant to our country. More importantly, we're going to have to see how we can coordinate as SAFTU with the rest of working class formations who are directly impacted by the drive to privatize Eskom and to eventually collapse it, and the need to, at the same time, fight for just transition that is going to ensure that whatever happens to Eskom, whatever happens to the environment doesn't happen at the expense of our ordinary people, the working class communities that we seek to serve. Felt that I must make those opening remarks, Comrade Matthew, Comrade Sikho, and all of you, dear comrades. And that's enough. I think I've said long enough than what I wanted to. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade GS. And again, to reiterate the warm welcome to everybody who's here, all the panelists and all the attendees. I am Ferrial Pedro. I'm the Working Class Campaigns Coordinator and Educator, and I'll be facilitating the first session of our program today. Our first session is titled The Challenge of Climate Change and the Just Transition. And we have two excellent speakers on the topic. Our first panelist is Comrade Professor Patrick Bond from the Department of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg. He will be opening this discussion on climate change today, broadly. Then we have Ferrial Adam, who is an environmental activist and a researcher and part of the Climate Justice Charter movement. Comrade Ferrial will be leading us on a discussion on the deep just transition. So each panelist will have 10 minutes, and then I'll take one or two questions, and then we'll have a Q&A after that. So thank you very much, comrades. Over to you, Comrade Patrick.
Away to Amandla. Okay, dear comrades are too muted. It's really great to be with you. And especially to Comrade Zwelinzima and the SAFTU office leadership. You've done such great work in this area. And to the office bearers and all the shop stewards and ordinary members, you are a hope, you know, the hope for the entire society. I did a lecture last month that covered what my bias in this is, which is to recover some of the ways a classical Marxism can be updated to particularly grapple with the race and gender, the new class, but also what I think our partnership with Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation allows. Also an awareness of capitalism's attack on nature, because I think eco-socialist, feminist, anti-racist politics that come from her tradition, and particularly the way she analyzed the world in her 1913 book, The Accumulation of Capital, I think it's very relevant. And she was informed by this attack on nature. This was the Scramble for Africa that was about 28 years before her book came out, or 20 years or so. And that was the Berlin conference that carved up the continent. Now, of course, we've seen the carving of Africa through colonialism and a neo-colonial BRICS carve up, the Scramble for Africa, in which especially China, but also India and Brazil and Russia, and on the continent, South African sub-imperialist capital has been particularly wicked in terms of ripping out Mother Nature. And Luxemburg really knew this because He's talked so much about the disintegration of non-capitalist relations that makes accumulation capital possible, because the non-capitalist, basically, she argued, would be eaten up and would be corroded and assimilated into capitalism as it expanded. And the most important of the productive forces is nature, the mineral treasure, the meadows, woods, and water. So her eco-socialism went very deep in understanding capital and the non-capitalist, especially in Africa. She studied South Africa, Namibia, the Congo very closely. And the systematic destruction and annihilation of non-capitalist social units, including nature, was critical. Now, we've been alerted really just last month of just how wicked capitalism is, because there's a new cost of the climate crisis that's just been unveiled in research that takes account of all of the new information about feedback effects. So it's now $3,000 per ton. Now, South Africa typically will emit about 500 megatons, which means if we costed our economy's damage to the world, so South African capitalism, what damage does it do? It's actually 3.3 times our annual GDP, so our climate debt, if you will, the reparations that our capitalist economy owes Africa, owes the victims of the cyclones that Comrade Zwelinzima was talking about. It's vast, so we have to really put a brake on it. Capitalism isn't helping. Just like Luxemburg said, it's self-destructive. It's showing all of the market incentive systems. You can just see it in the fossil fuel prices, right? The price of oil went down well below $20 a barrel in April, and now it's over $80 today. Coal was down to $50 per ton. Now it's about $240 today. Gas is up so much that our SANDF troops are in Mozambique to defend Total, ExxonMobil, China National Petroleum, Eni, and possibly Sasol in getting gas from the fourth largest field. Now, capitalism is meant to have self-correcting mechanisms, and the idea is to price carbon. And unfortunately, the way they set it up, really in the World Bank, the Kyoto Protocol, all of the systems at the United Nations, was to make profits. And if you know that South African capitalism is essentially a minerals energy complex amplified by financial parasitical activities, now about 23% of GDP. Typically, it should be closer to 10. You'll see that the financing or the commodification, let me put it even more bluntly, the privatization of the air that is proposed in the global carbon markets is not working. Right now, it's about 22% of all the emissions have a price, but is it the $3,000 that we need to make the system more rational on its own terms? The highest price is only $132 a ton that the Swedes impose on their industry. For South Africa's carbon tax, as you know, it's just tokenistic. It's only 42 cents. Now, the carbon markets are following global financial speculation. So you cannot rely on financial capitalism at a time when the financial bubbles have never been higher. South Africa's JSE, for example, peaking at 69,000, now a little bit less, but it's 400% of our GDP. That's what they call the Warren Buffett indicator, and that's the highest in world history. And the Dow Jones in New York, the Frankfurt DAX, the Nikkei in Tokyo, the Chinese markets, London, they're all completely around. Without going into details, I'm sure you know, especially our dear comrades in NUMSA, because look what happened to the iron ore price. The iron ore price went way high and then came way down just in the last month or so, right? A 50% crash. Today's Washington Post headline: the elites, the capitalist ruling class of the world who meet in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a key guy being John Kerry, Joe Biden's main man, and Boris Johnson hosting it in Glasgow next month. They're already admitting it's not going to work. And one reason is the alliance of imperialism and sub-imperial powers. Jacob Zuma representing South African fossil fuels and heavy industry, in what Bill McKibben at 350 called a league of super polluters, aiming to blow up the United Nations by basically ending any binding arrangement. So we have, as the Bureau puts it, a kind of G20, imperial, sub-imperial alliance, only one African in the house, South Africa, whose emitters have such pressure on their delegates that go there that they are simply not going to solve the problem. We saw this when there was demands from Africans at that Copenhagen meeting to end climate colonialism, right, and ecocide. And the key negotiator we trusted, and we still do, I would say, Lumumba Diaping, talked about how this would be a furnace, the Copenhagen Accord that Jacob Zuma signed on to, and Africans were bought out. And my dear comrades, I hope you do for me. I'm obviously in a zone of Joburg that's not so amenable. I'll just finish this very quickly because I know I'm at my 10 minutes. But it does strike me that if we look at all of the failures of Paris, we can expect them to continue into the Glasgow meeting, including the lack of adequate and proper financing, the lack of technology transfer, same as we know from COVID-19. Paris, according to the greatest climate scientist in the world, was bullshit. Greta Thunberg, leader of the world kind of youth movement on climate, simply says blah, blah, blah. The Italian minister basically says, yeah, she's right. South Africa is an exemplar because there's basically no change. From 440 megatons a year target in 2030, this Presidential Climate Commission run by Vavi Musa said, oh, we'll just go for 420. So they're not serious. What may make them serious is sanctions, trade sanctions, right? There's a carbon border adjustment mechanism that will be hitting aluminium, cement, fertilizer, and electricity. And so we have to take some kind of decision about whether we want to add to the pressure on the super polluters, the minerals energy complex that have state captured South Africa, including a former public steel company, now ArcelorMittal, the steel company was this score now private, because South Africa has the third highest emitter in the world per person per unit of output, only behind Kazakhstan and the Czech Republic. So we do have a major responsibility. If you look at Africa, we are far and away the highest emitter. Here's Africa. South Africa far ahead of Egypt, which will host the Conference of Polluters, the United Nations Summit next year. And then there are a few others that are important, but we're by and large the worst. And we do have, with SAFTU joining the CJC, the potential with SAFTU making arguments that we should ratchet up our ambitions, but to do so with a just transition. There's one clause in the nationally determined contribution statement, the statement by the South African government, which I think is very impressive. It says, what we need to do is non-fossil fuel development, but we need to have a just transition, and that needs to be paid for. I mean, I think South Africa should pay for it through taxing the rich and stopping these types of mega projects. The single biggest in the country's history, export of coal, 800 billion. Now, we thought it was stopped last year because the head of Transnet, Portia Derby, said, we see coal falling off the cliff. In other words, the price will collapse. So we're not going to actually extend the line of Transnet from Richards Bay all the way through Lephalale into Botswana, where there are 220 megatons of coal, massive carbon bomb that could be exploded. Now, they've been rethinking the last 3 weeks or so, and maybe the coal industry will pressure Transnet to go ahead with that 800 billion rand expansion. What you do, dear comrades, I think are always saying is, stop this nonsense. It's absurd. We need 1 million climate jobs. We need to be protesting at the sites where the minerals energy complex and the financiers have captured our state, whether that's DMRE, Treasury, the Reserve Bank. SAFTU, you held the future in labor, community, environment, youth, feminist alliances. 1 million climate jobs is one effort. I think SAFTU needs to put its imprint on, especially with the Metalworkers being so strong and progressive, on a non-privatized, socially owned, community-controlled, worker self-managed approach so that we really can move through this crisis to eco-socialism. Thank you, dear comrades.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Comrade Patrick. That was excellent. I think if comrades want to come in on any questions on Comrade Patrick's presentation, you can just raise your hand or let us know in the chat. But yeah, I mean, it was an excellent overview on South Africa, or capitalism's attack on nature and South Africa's contribution to the crisis and the opportunities for us as a labor movement to fight against this. We've already been doing that, but there's so much more work to be done for the fate of the working class and all of humanity, really. So I'm just checking if there are any questions. before we go on to Comrade Ferrial, questions of clarity or anything else comrades want to ask Comrade Patrick before we move on? Otherwise, I'll just hand over straight to Comrade Ferrial, and we'll do perhaps comrades need some time to think about it a little bit. There was a lot to take in. Comrade Patrick, thank you very much. So what I'll do is then we'll hand over to Comrade Ferrial, and then comrades can just think about any questions or contributions you'd like to make to the discussion, and we'll ask that or have that discussion after Comrade Ferrial's presentation. Thank you so much. Comrade Ferrial, over to you.
Thanks, Comrade Ferrial. Thank you, everyone. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'm going to share also my screen because I'm going to do a presentation as well. And it's always, it's funny because I was looking at Patrick's amazing presentation, and he always has these amazing pictures, and it really is so good that he gets all these things. And then mine is just lots of words, so I'm warning you, mine is not as colorful as Patrick's, but hopefully as useful. So I was asked, to chat about defining, because as COPAC, we've been talking about a deep, just transition. And so people were asking us, what now is a deep, just transition when we've been talking about a just transition? So I'll be defining or just giving you some information about the deep, just transition and why we felt the need to actually start saying deep, just transition rather than just a transition. And I'll talk about the shallow, just transition. And some of that Patrick actually touched on. And I want to talk about the 4 key points why a deep, just transition is necessary. And it's obviously the climate crisis. It's a plural vision. So having a whole vision of society and the problems we're facing. I want to tell you a little bit about the tool that we're developing at the moment, and then just give you some information as a movement, what we're doing in the next coming days, if that's okay. Sorry, I can't see the chat. So if I'm going too slow or any of that, just let me know, okay? Okay, so I think people know that the term just transition emerged out of the trade unions. And, it was around the conference of the polluters, as Patrick calls it, the UNFCCC meetings, where there was, big federations of unions who went there and started talking about the just transition. And what has happened subsequently is that when it was first being used, it was used by organizations, climate activists, trade unions, but more and more corporate companies, corporations and capital and all of those big kind of people with the monopolies are saying that we can't not use the term as well. And so what they're doing is they kind of bastardized the term, excuse my word, but they're using and abusing the term just transition. So you'll see it in government statements, you'll see it in CECIL, they'll say we're moving to a just transition and all of that. And really what they're saying is we're using the term, but we're gonna do things the same. And so we're saying that a deep just transition is a transition from a carbon-based society to a low or zero carbon society with no person left behind, while meeting the needs of workers and the most vulnerable. It seeks to transform energy, food, transport, and all major social systems to ensure we sustain life, while making sure that those who are already vulnerable do not carry the cost. The key issue is that capital must bear the burden of the transition, not workers and communities. And that is important because in previous presentations, when we talk about the just transition as workers, you would be like, you can't shut down coal. We're not going to have jobs. And we're saying you are right. And that is why capital must bear that burden. They must, they must be the one that deal with the losses, not workers. So a just transition takes the views and needs of workers seriously. And in the transition, workers are particularly vulnerable. And the just transition must ensure that they do not bear the brunt of that transition, right? So workers are an essential part to that transition. Because you talk about renewable energy, talk about alternative systems, it is the workers that's going to be building that. And that's the reality. So the shallow transitions that governments and neoliberals propose is a change within the existing system. And that we can see is not working. You know, they come with their false solutions, they come with the trading of carbon, and they just make money from everything. But the deep just transition is we're saying that there has to be a change of the entire system. We cannot continue the way we are. In food, for example, which is a simple example, is a shallow transition will advocate for lowering carbon emissions in agriculture. You know, so they use small little changes, but a deep just transition goes further than that. It's about democratizing our food. It's about having a food commons. And if you think about it, you know, this is not far from the reality. If you look at what happened under under COVID, where people were going hungry. And where did they get the food from? From community activists, from people, from food gardens, you know, localized food gardens. That's where people got food from. It was not from commercialized agriculture, and it was not from government as much as they should have. So the shallow just transition, which I'm calling, is literally false solutions. And Patrick, I know, has done so much on this, and he can really do a lot. You know, he has 1,000 presentations if people want. I'm putting you on the spot, Patrick, on carbon capture and the whole issue of this climate meeting that we're going into, this conference of the polluters that's happening in Glasgow, which besides polluting is an issue around apartheid vaccine and all of that. It's just atrocious that it's going ahead the way it is. But the key thing that's going to come out of this is this whole issue of net zero. And net zero allows countries to continue to pollute, but then to reduce with, like, whether they're having carbon capture and storage or whether they're planting forests. And we're saying that that is not a real reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So they need to change that. So it reinforces social and economic inequalities, and it aggravates the climate crisis, right? It encourages more of the same. So we need to move away from a neoliberal obsession with economic growth towards realizing the needs of people and economic systems and ecosystems, sorry. And the reality is we have to do it. The science is saying that we are in such a bad state, and, you know, Patrick spoke about it, that, and simple things like the people born now in our in this time will experience 6 you know, climate disasters in their lifetime. Whereas for us that are older, it's 2 or even 3 is like the max. And so things are really getting bad, and we have to deal with the climate crisis as a whole. We need to limit the impacts that people are going to experience. And the reality is the ones who will experience it the hardest and the worst is, firstly, in terms of countries, it's the developing countries. And secondly, within a society, it's more vulnerable is the workers, the poor, the landless, people with disabilities, women and children. And we saw that as well with COVID. So we know about the climate crisis, right? This is why we need a deep, just transition, is that, again, I have to just say again, because every report that the IPCC has come out with, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is made up of hundreds and hundreds of scientists, have come out. This is their 6th report, and each one has been damning. It has been, this is urgent, we need to move. And what happens is government doesn't move. And I mean, all governments, right, in that respect. And I'm hoping, I mean, they were saying that this is now, we at almost past midnight, you know, they talk about the crises. So I think we need to really, really change the way we're doing things. And I think that the power is within a deep, just transition and working from the ground with people on the ground and with workers. And the climate crisis is part of a civilizational crisis. We're going to see a lot of human life being affected. You know, we're going to have a lot of biodiversity food systems that are just going to go extinct. And I think that if anything, COVID is like this small wave of opening our eyes. And I'm actually shocked at how the world has been able to play down the number of people who've died during this pandemic. And we need to realize that this is small in comparison to what will happen with the climate crisis, or is happening with the climate crisis. So we're running out of time. And the global negotiations that occur each year is just a waste of money and people's time, really. It's not getting us anywhere. We need to take back that power as people on the ground. And one of the ways is to create that transition and to move towards building our movements. Just to say that, you know, we're expecting, South Africa is going, we've come out of a drought. We're expecting to go into our next drought in the coming months. And that's going to hit us really hard. We need to be prepared. We saw what happened in the previous one. We've already got cities and towns besides Cape Town, because the focus was on Cape Town, but there are many towns in Eastern Cape and Western Cape who are already experiencing day zero. And so we need to preempt this next crisis coming up. It's really going to hit us very bad. So a plural vision, why? What is that? It's basically saying having a whole view. We've got to tackle the climate problem from all dimensions. It's not an environmental issue. It's not just a climate issue. We have to address a whole range of issues: race, class, gender, ecological injustice. And that's why we talk about a climate justice charter, or climate justice in that respect. So for us, the climate justice charter is our plural vision. You know, when we developed it, we had consultations with students, with health workers, with unions, with teachers, with media. So, you know, we've got input from all sectors to say, how do we deal with this? And so we're using that climate justice charter as an organization to develop policies that can be useful. At the moment, we're working on a water policy, because our water is in dire straits in our country, and we really need to do something about it soon. So the climate justice charter is that we're using that as a tool to build the transition pathway. So looking at food sovereignty, looking at defending the water commons, you know, having we need to take back our democracy. We're going into local government elections, but we need to find a way where we have real democracy, where people actually have the power to make changes. And we've seen that in small little pockets. We need to build that a lot more. So the Deep Trust Transition tool, just so for everyone to know, that we're working on and should be released by the end of the year, is aimed at empowering and enabling activists and to create a knowledge of the ecological crisis, the failing capitalist system, and then the ways that we can influence policy and change. So we don't look at it as just something that unions must take forward. We do think that they need to be part of it and spearhead it. So we're looking at a tool that can be used in workplaces, within community structures, and even local governments can have a look at it and develop this bottom-up participatory approach, right? It is an informative tool and educational tool. When it is released, we will share it with comrades, and you can all then use it as you like. And the guide literally challenges our thinking around a socio-ecological system. And it does talk about breaking away from our current carbon-based ecocidal system. And I think sometimes that's really hard to do. So it's really an activist tool on a deep just transition, what it means, how do we use it in our places, where we work, live, etc. So that's what we do. And through that, we just to share that, you know, building a movement is imperative, and there's different types of movements. But we think that the charter is one way that we're doing this. We have a petition that we've started to get the charter adopted by Parliament. We submitted it to Parliament last year. We've had no response. We're actually taking it back to Parliament this year. And we have an assembly tomorrow, tomorrow's World Food Day, by the way. And we taking this charter, we're demanding that Parliament gives us a response to the charter, but also we're launching our manifesto, critique of the political parties' manifestos on climate and how they fared, which obviously you can think is quite bad. We'll be using it to train activists and partners. And we are calling for, working class unity and people's power. So we can't just give lip service to the Red-Green Alliance. We need to make it a reality. And I think the time has come, and the opportune moment has come for that to happen in South Africa. And just so you know, that the climate justice, with having this alliance, we think that we can deal with inequality, a just transition or deep just transition, and defending and strengthening our democracy. I think that is the aim of this whole movement, is to give back people's power and voices. And so we invite SAFTU. I think SAFTU has an important role and has been spearheading and have had, really good positions very often. So that has been really important. And I think it'll be great to adopt the charter, as well as to join us as we try to take this to Parliament, or, have a look at it and see if you support it as well. This is my end of my talk. I'm just showing you some of the activities that's happening in the next coming weeks. So tomorrow is the Climate Justice Assembly at between 2 and 4 at 16. If anyone wants the links, I can put them into the chat, so please let me know. The links to the Zoom links, because this obviously doesn't link. And then we're having, everyone on the 5th is the Africa Day of Action. So organizations across Africa are taking action on climate. And then on the 6th is the Global Day of Action. So we're doing something on the 6th. And then we're also going to Parliament on the 9th of November to get Parliament to listen to us on the Climate Justice Charter and to get it adopted. So those are our activities in the coming weeks. I hope I've covered everything. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Comrade Ferrial. Oh, let me put my video on. That was very illuminating. I mean, it's the first time I've come across this term of a deep just transition. And it was very interesting to see to understand how the term just transition has been co-opted by, reactionary forces without making any real changes. I wonder, could you tell me, do you know any examples of the shallow transition in the South African response to the crisis? I'll just ask my own question before taking it to the floor. Yeah. Do you have a response? Yeah, go ahead.
So a very, very simple one that comes to my mind is, when you would talk about the carbon tax and how government relates to carbon tax. And they would tax companies, but not high enough to actually change behavior. So that's the one thing. The other thing is also the way that they deal with transport. It's not looking at a system that needs to be changed. It's still looking at how do we still feed particular corporations. And that is where you can see some of that. And agriculture is also, they talk about, we need to have, recently we've had the, president talk about greener energy, etc. But what they mean is, and green coal or clean coal. What did Montage talk about? Clean coal. There is no such thing as clean coal. And that's where you talk, that's where you see a shallow transition happening. So it's happening in our water, it's happening in our energy and the food. I mean, if you think about the way we produce food, it's really problematic. If you think of the climate crisis, and if you think of how the pandemic hit now, where people could not get food, because what's happening is our food's been grown in huge commercialized farms and you don't have access. So they talk about, let's get, they talk about agriculture as a way to reduce carbon. So they talk about simple things like changing the tillage or changing the way that they farm, but they don't change the system of agriculture. It's still in the hands of a few. And that's exactly the shallow transition.
Thanks, Com. And another thing that I found very interesting was when you talk about Plural Vision, we've seen the disproportionate impact of climate change on the global south and on Black women, particularly in rural areas. Can you talk more about the intersection between race, class, and gender, and how a deep transition would take that into account?
So that's the whole thing, is that when you talk about climate change, it's not just talking about it from an environmental perspective or conservation perspective. It has to look at a change in the system. And when you change your system and become a more democratized system and a more democratized state, you have to look at the people who have been marginalized. And who are the ones that have been marginalized, right? It's women, it's children, it's people of color. And that's where you have to, you can't deal with those issues without also then tackling. So for example, let me give you a simple example. If we look at our climate policies, so in South Africa, a lot of the local governments have to have a climate change strategy. And within the climate change strategy, they talk about transport changing, and they talk about land, blah, blah, blah. Everything is high level and big. But if you ask them who are the most vulnerable and who are the most impacted on by local aspects of climate change. So if you take fires, if you take floods, I mean, if you look at the extreme weather we're having, every time we have a downpour or thunderstorms in Johannesburg, for example, it is informal settlements, it is people with poor housing that get washed away. And then how do we build that mechanism for them to deal with, to actually build that themselves up again, right? But within those climate policies, very little emphasis is on that, on the poor, on women. And you talk about women in rural areas, yes, they are very highly affected, but urban women as well. Because what happens with women in urban areas, not only do they have to, get to work using or walk far distances, it's about home fires because you don't have adequate electricity. It's about polluted water because you don't have taps in your home. And those are the kinds of things as well at an urban level that's going to get worse with climate change. You know, if you don't have water, you're going to be forced to use polluted water that's down your street. So those are the things that are not covered in the climate change strategies across. I've looked at policies at Ekurhuleni, City of Joburg, City of Cape Town. It's bland, it's gender blind. It's literally gender blind. And I think that's what we're saying when we talk about a shallow transition. And when we talk about Plural Vision, you can't not talk about that in a deeper way in your policies.
Thank you so much, Comrade Ferrial. That was very, very good and very interesting to understand this difference, this distinction between a deep and a shallow just transition, because that's also a term we use, a just transition. So now we know, to talk about rather a deep just transition rather than this term that's been co-opted by the ruling class. Thank you so much, comrades, and thank you again, Comrade Patrick, for your contribution, your intervention. I'm gonna open it up to the floor now for questions. I see there's already a question from Comrade Kitso. Can we allow Comrade Kitso to ask his question in the video? Comrade Kitso, do you want to ask it, or should I just read it out? Can we get Comrade Kitso to ask his question? I see there was some activity in the chat, which is fine, but I think it would benefit everybody if we had that discussion in our session too, for people who missed the chat. Can you allow Comrade Kitso to speak? Unmute him.
Yeah, hello, Pedro. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yes, so I'm going to read out the question as I asked it in the chat box. So I came late to the presentation by Patrick, but I just wanted to find out, just to get some clarity, because I didn't quite understand the part of his presentation where he was talking about Transnet and the coal industry. So what I wanted to find out from him was what was the key take home of that component or that aspect of his presentation, and also how it relates to sustainable employment. Because he did mention, the fact that, Miniji Mine, which is a Botswana company, well, at least it has some offices in Botswana, recently, the borders have been opened or some agreement was signed between Menergy and Transnet on coal. So I wanted to understand what the take home was and also how it relates to sustainable employment. I guess that will also make way for a follow-up question, I believe. Thank you.
Okay, Comrade Patrick, I'll let you answer. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. And you're doing great work in managing us. I think the main point that I started with, Comrade Kissa, is that capitalism cannot solve this existential crisis through its own internal systems. So this is exemplified by Transnet. Under Brian Molefe, who just by coincidence was the husband of the current Transnet CEO, Portia Molefe, as you probably knew her in DTI days. Brian Molefe and his successor, Siyabonga Gama, had no regard for nature, for workers, for communities. They externalized the costs. That's what capitalism does. It says, let's just dump our pollution. Let's dump our migrant labor system with its gender bias. Let's just dump those on poor people, on the environment. And so the 800 billion rand that they allocated in both Transnet, Eskom, and with private companies in a public-private plundering strategy, a PPP strategy, was to take 18 billion tons of coal from the Waterberg and export it. And next door to the Waterberg in Lephalale is Botswana, where there's 220 billion. Now, this is a real carbon bomb. This will make solving the climate crisis impossible. This is what South African capitalism threatens the world with, right? And Botswanan capitalism. And the dilemma is that in this struggle to prevent Transnet from doing this, our main allies were the Guptas, because they corrupted the process with China South Rail and the China Development Bank, and that cost tens of billions of more for this than it should have. So it is sort of ground to a halt, and Portia Derby looked at advanced pricing on coal, which is, she can look ahead 17 years with her models. And it's not because of climate that Portia Derby is saying, maybe we shouldn't do this. It's because the coal price might mean it's a stranded asset just financially, right? And I think that's one of the great challenges we have, which is why I stress delegitimization of these elites. Because who codified this? It was Jacob Zuma. He commissioned a national planning commission, and that had a national infrastructure strategy. A #1 project, the biggest in the country's history, PIC-SIP1, Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Commission, Strategic Integrated Project #1, which unfortunately not enough NGOs and journalists and academics like myself are aware of, but PIC-SIP1, approved by the deputy chair of that National Planning Commission, who was a massive coal tycoon. He ran a company called Shanduka. His name? Cyril Ramaphosa. So they proposed this massive export of coal. To stop that and to move that money back into just transition would be so logical, right? Just demands workers, communities, environmentalists, women, especially the youth, the next generation. And when Fees Must Fall came up, they said, why are we spending 800 billion rand a year on 800 billion on this project, when just for 40 billion a year, we could have free education to invest in the youth and its education rather than invest in its destruction. That's, to me, the spirit of the delegitimization of our elites that's desperately needed. And that Transnet project, that insane 800 billion rand, the Transnet, Eskom, and their private allies have put towards extracting 18 billion tons of coal, should be, the poster child for what not to do, and instead to get labor involved in demanding a just transition with all that sort of resources. We're not short of money. It's, as you see in that page 27 on the slides, it's all just going in the wrong places.
Thank you, Comrade Patrick. Oh, it's so infuriating. It's really frustrating, and I think we really have to build our movement so that we can move money, where we need it. So I'm going to read Comrade Roland from Rosa-Luxemburg's question, and then you said you answered it live, Comrade Patrick. So it goes, hi Patrick, loved your presentation as always. How do you assess the just transition in South Africa from a worker's perspective? Do you think that governments are serious about or committed to this issue? I have a sense of what you're going to answer there. Energy master plan, auto sector master plan, etc. Do you think that they understand the anxiety around losing jobs? How do trade unions engage in order for society in general to start relitigating this topic in the public space? And that's from Comrade Roland. And
Comrade Roland will probably know that it's German companies that have been driving massive subsidies, about 30 billion rand a year, for exporting luxury cars, not mass-based cars for our working class, or not, particularly good public transport. As we know, it's falling apart, but luxury cars get 30 billion rand a year. They're not even electric vehicles. Now they're going to be hit with this carbon border adjustment mechanism. I'm sure Roland knows the EU is pushing to put a climate tax. So this is imperialist protectionism against the high carbon intensity that the German auto companies have been building in to the exports, and that we're subsidizing. We'll have to subsidize more. So I'm really hoping our NUMSA comrades in the auto industry will say, stop, where's our electric vehicles? There are none being made here. Where's our public transport investment with that 30 billion? Where's our nationalized car companies? If we have to have cars, let's make sure that they are affordable for the masses, right? These are the sorts of questions I hope a just transition would bring to the surface. But I think, Roland, it's like asking Digital Vibes to be paid by Zwelinzima to do education on vaccines, right? It's a scam. Or as Ferrial said, it's tokenism. It's like a 350 rand a month income support for the massive unemployed during the COVID crisis. Tokenism. And that's really what we're seeing, especially with the Presidential Climate Commission run by Vali Musa. Musa, by the way, facilitated Hitachi bribing the ANC through Chancellor House, right? He was the chair of ESCOM and on the ANC Finance Committee. The public protector at the time, 2008, said this is an improper conflict of interest. So asking tough questions about these elites, especially of Ali Musa, who says we shouldn't do 440 megatons a year by 2030, let's make it 420. Again, tokenism, and really towards the overthrow, right? An eco-socialist overthrow, hopefully through the ballot box, of this wicked, carbon-addicted, corrupted government would logically follow that process of delegitimization. This is the single biggest problem for capitalism to solve. It can't do it on its own. We know that from all the evidence, right? There's no evidence that internal price signals, technological changes, anything capitalism has to offer as a solution will work. It's clearly failing. And it really is then, I think, a very important argument for the working class in this country and the continent and the world to say an eco-socialist strategy is the only way forward to plan what we do with the massive amounts of resources we have that are currently being wasted or for utterly destructive uses in the cases I've described. I hope that begins to get to it, comrade. Oh, one last point. The most critical single site of this struggle over a just transition would be in a place called Somkhele, where next Friday, there's a memorial for 1 year after Fikile Nchikazi was assassinated, possibly by workers. That's an allegation. There are NUM and AMCU workers who support expansion of a coal mine run by a really wicked white-owned company called Petmin. It's called Tendele Mine. And she was assassinated October 22nd, 2020, fighting that coal mine using climate arguments. I think if comrades in the labor movement could say a just transition is what was needed. And those workers who may have had a role in assassinating Fikile and Nchikazi because they wanted the expansion of the mine could then say, look, there is money for a just transition. We don't need to be assassinating women leaders in the climate movement. A notorious case last month, all over the world, there were interviews with Fikile's daughter. So next Friday in Somkhele, I hope comrades from SAFTU can go and really be part of a memorial to say, if we could get a just transition in a despicably oppressed place, right? From KwaZulu territory, where the apartheid system just dumped people on the edge of the oldest game park in Africa, Mfolozi. Then we could really say the just transition would be a way forward for an alternative. So we won't have these damn assassinations and divide and conquer strategies between labor and the rest of the movements, right? Amandla, comrades.
Okay, thank you, Comrade Patrick. We have one last question for you. So all the questions are for you, but I have a little discussion with Comrade Ferrial, but we have one last from Comrade Ferrial herself. And she says she'd love to know what you think about, or she says she agrees with you on the Climate Commission. She'd love to know what you think about organizations like Earthlife, Groundwork, and Greenpeace that are on the commission as well.
I would have loved to see a couple of things happen in the recent period. And the first would have been that those comrades, including from SAFTU, who were in that climate commission, could have called out Vali Musa and the chair of the commission, Cyril Ramaphosa, as themselves implicated in our climate crimes, right? And secondly, that if there is an attempt to do technical work in a commission like that, let's use a number like $3,000, right? Or 45,000 Rand per ton of emissions doing damage. We have a climate debt as a result. And then thirdly, I would even like our dear comrades in the Climate Justice Coalition to be raising these issues the way I think on September 22nd through 27th, the CJC's activists did to delegitimize the Minister of Minerals and Energy, Gwede Mantashe, through protests. But likewise, the Climate Justice Charter, a fantastic initiative, full support. But whether going to Parliament to ask Parliament to actually make some changes like that when they're very much part of the problem, when we really need much more effort to delegitimize and legitimize the struggles from below, like Fikile and Shingazi's struggle. That to me would be some of the ways forward to strengthen all of us, right? By being more militant as the times definitely demand. Thanks, comrades.
Okay, thank you, Comrade Patrick. And there's a last question for you, Comrade Ferrial, just to wrap up. The Climate Justice Charter's engagement for a just transition. Could you give us a sense of the engagement with higher education institutions? What has been the relationship between the Climate Justice Charter and higher education, and a just transition in higher education institutions?
Okay, so the one thing that we have been doing is we've been having discussions with various, where we have students and student groups. We've been having discussions with universities to adopt the charter. And part of that, adopting the charter, then links to other organizations like Fossil Free South Africa and I think 350.org that are trying to get universities to disinvest or to divest from fossil fuels. So they all have this stake, they all have money that they've invested. And we're saying that they need to not invest in fossil fuels. But that's the one element. The other element is so let me give you an example of it. We've given the charter, we've asked them to adopt the charter. And we also talk on campus about ending student hunger. And one of the ways that we've been working with the university on that is to develop, we have adverts, food gardens, where before COVID, when people were on campus, there's a center that would then cook food, and we'd have students who had no food to be able to get access to the gardens and to cook food. So that's in terms of democratizing our food, food sovereignty on campus. So we're actually trying to do that in practical ways, but also at a policy university level, we're trying to change it by them adopting the charter itself. It's a long process. It's difficult negotiation sometimes, but I think universities are getting on board.
Okay, thank you so much, Comrade Ferrial and Comrade Patrick. I think the main takeaway for me is that we have to build an anti-capitalist, eco-socialist movement. And as SAFTU, we'll have to engage on the Climate Justice Charter. All these presentations will be made available for further discussion and further engagement. Of course, you're all our comrades, so we'll continue to have engagement with you. So that's the end of that panel discussion. Thank you very much, everybody who's asked questions, and Ferrial and Patrick. Next, we're going to discuss Eskom and energy in our country more specifically, which obviously has huge implications for NUMSA workers and for the climate crisis in our country. So I'm going to hand over to Comrade Teva, who will be facilitating that discussion. Thanks, comrades.
Thanks, Comrade Ferron, and to the panelists who just made contributions. And thank you for your lucid presentations. And it indeed sets a tone for the discussion which will be taking place currently. And thank you also for laying the political economy of the climate crisis and the energy crisis across the world, but also the struggles that would emanate out of that particular crisis and challenges. Thank you very much. The current session, which is the second session, I will be chairing it. Let me first start by greeting everybody who's in attendance, the leadership of SAFTU, the NOBs who are present here, the members of the National Executive Committee of SAFTU who are present also here, and leaders of trade union affiliates of SAFTU. Secondly, let me also greet the rest of the panelists who have honored our invitation to this particular political discussion or induction. I will be chairing a session on Eskom and power, and I have three panelists who would be making presentations at the current moment, and this would be Comrade Ted Blom, who is the energy expert, will be followed by Dominic Brown from Economic Justice Program Manager, is an Economic Justice Program Manager at the Alternative Information and Development, who they've recently published a very useful report on Eskom transformation, or the transformation of Eskom energy production globally, and of course in the country. And then the last speaker will be Comrade Alex Lenferna, who is a director at 350.org and is also our secretary for the Climate Justice Coalition. The first speaker will be Comrade Ted Blom. Comrades would recall that on the 31st of March this year, SAFTU went and launched a case of fraud, corruption, and money laundering with the Santin police station. And we did launch that particular case for further investigations with the assistance of Comrade Ted Blom. Comrade Ted Blom, I would give you the space to speak about the Eskom disaster. Of course, that would include mismanagement of Eskom, lack of maintenance, overpricing of coal, but also the stealing of coal, which currently has been said to be a serious crisis at Eskom, also contributing to the ballooning debt that Eskom finds itself in at the current moment. Ted Blom, the space is yours.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I assume that you can, and I'm going to go right into my presentation, if I may. Right, okay, so yeah, my presentation is headed Eskom, or the IPPs, who will solve South Africa's energy crisis. And I'm also going to cover some myths versus reality. I think the South African energy arena is a bit like playing a Russian roulette. People are you know, all sort of putting their cards on the table and want to participate. There are very few clear guidelines. There's a lot of corruption, and there's a lot of money to be made for those who actually get the nod to go ahead and drive. And we can see that with a lot of noise coming from a lot of stakeholders. At this stage, I'm still independent. I don't have any income at the moment from the coal industry or from anybody else in the energy domain. I'm busy retiring, and so this is one of my few last participations in the debate. I'm not necessarily a background on Eskom. We'll do a quick options analysis. We'll look at the outlook of Eskom, gas, renewables, hybrids, and opportunities. Okay, so in the last couple of months, we've seen that the government has raised or opened the table and allowed companies to, and individuals if they want to produce up to 100 megawatts of power. I think it's one of the crisis steps the government has taken, given that Eskom can no longer supply adequate power, and everybody wants their jobs and don't want to lose their jobs because of lack of power. So this has been sort of a crisis management exercise by the government. I welcome it because at the end of the day, as a citizen of this country, I don't want to have all my eggs in one basket, especially if the basket is poorly managed and corrupted, as we've seen with Eskom. I think that there's a lot of lies and myths going on. Eskom made big noise about paying back 80 billion rand on their debt, or 480 billion rand. When I queried that during their presentation, it seems like the facts are not quite the facts. And some of that 80 billion rand was a direct transfer of the tax donation to Eskom, or subsidy to Eskom. It went straight out the door to pay some of the debt, and 20 billion was just playing with the accounting policy and taking advantage of a stronger rand, instead of just sorting out Eskom onto a healthier footing, which everybody knows is a crime. Currently, we have Eskom making noises that they will need about 300 billion to address the emissions and also fix up the power stations. The Rater's big claim to fame was, when he came on board, is that he'll fix up the power stations and refurbish them, the coal fleet I'm talking about now, in 18 months. 18 months has come and gone. The coal fleet is more broken than ever before. And in fact, Eskom's lying about the level of load shedding, and I've got adequate proof of that. And he's also now said that he's actually not going to refurbish the coal power stations because he thinks it is a far better investment to be made in the renewable area. And we can debate that as well. As I said, I've got no holy cows. I see it, I call it the way I see it. Okay, what has also hit us, of course, in the last couple of years, and it's a bit more than what the General Secretary mentioned. We've had rising electricity tariffs, and there are over 900 tariffs in the country. So it's a bit of taking your pick as to which tariff you want to focus on. But some of the tariff increases have been well in excess of 500%. And in fact, certain parties have even had up to 700% tariff increase. And this is anti-constitutional. The Constitution determines that regulated prices should not increase beyond CPI. And if you take the Constitution together with Note 71 from Treasury, Eskom has been illegally increasing tariffs together with NERSA since 2007. And that is something that needs to go to court. I've got some people who are prepared to fund that, but I don't have the full funds to take that. So my main gripe is I'm not going to get too involved with the climate argument. I have my own views. I'll make a closing statement on that. But what I do have a big bitch about is corruption, because that's stealing money out of your and my mouth and threatening our livelihood. Eskom still has 20,000 people overstaffed, and you might say, well, you know, at least they got jobs. The fact of the matter is Eskom staff are vastly under-deployed. Besides being superfluous, they're also earning 4 times the international average salary and not doing much work. There's also massive coal, which the Rater said he would sort out, and I'll highlight an article further on in a couple of seconds as to where we are with the coal situation. And then, of course, generation issues. You've heard time and time again that Eskom has blamed old plant. That's also a myth. I'll show you some of that as well from actual Eskom data. But the fact of the matter is, as we sit here today, Eskom supplies around about 90% of the country's power, and all our eggs are in one basket, and you must decide whether you are confident having all your eggs in a basket that has been very corruptly managed, as has been alluded to, by political siphoning off of funds, political-driven decisions. And in fact, the Zondo Commission hasn't done a full job. I'm about to, if I'm going to publish something more, maybe publish a book on the questions that Zondo has not answered, because there are more questions not answered than questions actually answered. Let me just go back to 2008. This is more or less where Eskom was. You see the blue is the old stations, the very old stations. Then in orange, you got the midlife stations. And then right at the bottom, you got Medupi and Kusile. And so what Eskom's Cavalier board decided at the time is that they're going to cull the blue stations. They're not going to refurbish them and not going to maintain them properly. And that capacity will be more than made up by those two little dots at the bottom, Medupi and Kusile. And what you see here is the age graph of the different power stations. I will show to you that this strategy has fallen apart, not because the old power stations haven't delivered, they have in fact delivered, but because of the corruption and misalignment and misconfiguration of the new stations, and the corruption on their coal supply agreements as well. You know, if you're going to run a coal power station, you better give it the fuel that it's designed to use. You can't go and put power paraffin and diesel and cooking oil into your car's fuel tank. It's made to run on petrol, it must be fed petrol. If it's made to be run on diesel, it needs to be fed diesel. And the same thing goes for the coal power stations. If they've been spec'd to a certain design, that's what they need to be fed, and not all sorts of odd sods from every Tom, Dick, and Harry who pays a kickback to Eskom officials. Okay, and I was commissioned by Eskom in 2006, 2008 to review the coal roadmap. I was previously involved with Eskom's planning and finance in the 80s when I worked at Eskom, when it was on its way to becoming a world-class utility. It won that award in 2001 with above 90% energy availability, some of the lowest costs in the world. And as the General Secretary said, for more than 80 years at that time, Eskom had been the main driver of South Africa's competitive advantage to develop our resources internally, create jobs, etc., etc. A statistic I saw this week from a well-renowned economist, Mike Schuessler from economist.coza, is that he's compared South Africa's manufacturing output, and thanks to this government, our output has gone back to 1969 levels. In other words, this government has destroyed 52 years of growth in our manufacturing output. And I'm not even talking about the loss of jobs in the coal mines and the loss of jobs in other sectors, but just on the manufacturing sector, we've lost 52 years of economic growth. And that's why so many people are now sitting unemployed, because the manufacturing sector would have been where they would have hopefully been gainfully employed if we had grown our economy as was promised by the government. And yeah, we see that Eskom's approved higher coal prices, and this relates directly to the comment that was made about the charges we laid together with your General Secretary and with NUM in March. The ANC has bought a stake in Duva coal supply, and on the first day that contract was in power, the so-called clean, new and clean broom at Eskom signed a new coal supply agreement that took the coal price from 190 Rand a ton to over 550 Rand a ton, which of course will directly benefit the new shareholders, the ANC, through Tebe Investments and Bata Trust. And you must decide whether it's good that a connected party gets such a high coal price when nobody else can get that same coal price. And everybody bitched when the Guptas were paid or offered such a high coal price. So that inevitably will lead to even a more expensive electricity tariff, as Eskom will have to recoup the money from somebody that they're now feeding the ANC with. And then the other issue is that we've had this plus 500% tariff increases over the last 14 years. The Constitution says that there shouldn't be no more than 79%, which is the CPI over the same period. The SIU have now admitted that they're investigating 178 billion rands worth of corruption at Eskom. Now, you must ask yourself, how much of the money that you and I have been paying extra over the last 12, 14 years has gone directly into corruption. And that's why Eskom's debt has ballooned from 40 billion to over 400 billion, is that you and I and the banks who have lent Eskom the money are actually funding the corruption. And very little of that, in fact, less than 2 billion of that has actually been clawed back. And it seems to me those wheels are grinding exceptionally slowly. So, and that's my big bit. So this is the stuff that I think about at night when I go to sleep, is how certain people have hijacked this economy, hijacked our jobs, hijacked our futures, and hijacked our competitive position as a growing economy, and as an economy that wants to promise anyway a better life for everybody. That certainly hasn't happened, and now you know exactly where the money has gone. Yeah, we're talking about the sales of Eskom. In red, you'll see that there's been a 10% sales drop in Eskom's demand. And that is because more and more businesses are going out of business because they can't afford the high electricity prices. The reason the municipalities can't pay for their electricity is because, again, the tariffs are far higher than what they should have been. They were by about a factor of 500 to 700% higher. You and I haven't received inflation adjusted increases or above inflation adjusted. So we're not in a position to pay higher electricity tariffs because we don't have those increases. The only people who get these astronomical increases are Eskom and Eskom staff. So the whole cake is busy crumbling. I'm looking at Eskom's availability. You'll see this graph is very clear. From 2001, where it was around 90%, as I said earlier on, and 95, in fact, in a couple of months, it's gone down. And the number for yesterday was 57%. So we're now below 60% energy availability factor. What does that mean? That means of all the plant that Eskom claims to have available and which we are paying a return to Eskom in our tariffs for, less than 60% is actually in a working condition. So we are paying 40% of our tariff that we are paying is going towards plant that's no longer functionally operational and cannot produce electricity. And that's why we're having load shedding. Because there's not enough working components. Even though they're spending so much money and have stolen so much money, they can't keep the generators running. And this number is going steadily down. In fact, I predicted a fall to below 50% when I with international financiers in about 2010. And we might have been out by a year or two towards the 50% and 50% availability. That means that Eskom can only supply half of the power that we require. And that's why the government has been forced to open up power production to everybody that has the means to do that. And then I want to just get to Eskom's lies. You know, it's one thing to have a monopoly. It's one thing to have a state-run entity. It's another thing when that state-run entity lies to you. I've got on the screen here, and I hope you can all see it, that if you look at the load shedding number that's in the middle of Sikonati's statement there, he's talking about load shedding of 2,267 megawatts, and that was on the 2nd of June. So the day after they signed this expensive coal contract with the ANC, Bata Trust and Tebe Investments, we had load shedding of level 2. Now the rules say that up to 1,000 megawatts is level 1 load shedding. Up to 2,000 megawatts is level 2 load shedding. Above 2,000 megawatts is level 3 or more load shedding. Eskom only announced level 2 load shedding. You can see that on their own numbers, they were lying to the public because there were over 2,000 megawatts of load shedding. Below that, you can see a screenshot from Eskom's operations room. And I'm not going to tell you who gave me the screenshot. But if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that the load shedding, the shortfall, at 6 o'clock, at 5 to 6, 1755.33, the actual shortfall was 5,136 megawatts. Ladies and gentlemen, that's level 6 load shedding because it rounds up to the next level. And Eskom is telling you we only got a level 2 load shedding. And everybody phones me up and says, why the hell, if we only got level 2 load shedding, haven't we got lights in Cape Town, Durban, Port Elizabeth, East London, Bloemfontein, and even Pretoria? So you see, this is what really irks me, because you and I, we believe, or we have to believe somebody as to whether we must start our next shift and bake the bread and so on and send our miners underground which we can't do if there's excessive load shedding, because we've got to safeguard their lives and their cooling and their breathing and be able to bring them back safely to surface. We can't do that when there's heavy load shedding. And we certainly are taking massive risks if we think there's level 2 load shedding and it's actually level 6 load shedding. So this nonsense of Eskom's lies needs to be stopped, and it needs to be stopped fast, because they are going to kill people. The people at hospitals that can't breathe because they're on breathalyzers or breathing machines that go off when there's load shedding, etc. I'm not going to expand on that. It just makes me furious. Yeah, we hear about the old plant that's broken all the time and not working. Here's a screen grab from that same day, the 2nd of June, when we had the load shedding. On the left is Kusile, and you'll see that there are only 3 units working, and unit 1 was working at about 30% of output. The other unit 3 was working at the proper output, or close to the proper output. It's not quite at 800 megawatts, at 722, as you can see there. And unit 2 was at 664 megawatts. So Kusile was not performing according to spec. Go look at the right-hand column, Medupi. Was way below 50% of output. So this nonsense of Eskom saying we need more money to fix up the old units because they're broken and not dependable is absolute nonsense. It's more money to go into the corrupted Kusile, Medupi, and Ngula contracts, as you can see, and they're not delivering the stuff that you and I have been told they delivered. Again, another blatant lie by Eskom. As far as coal costs are concerned, I was called into Eskom in January 2020 by the operating director, Mr. Oberholzer, who knows me from the 1980s. And he introduced me to the new CEO and said, here's the guy who will sort out your coal problems. He was pulled in by Eskom on a number of occasions previously. I was told to my face that the new CEO is a coal expert, Dr. Coal, and he doesn't need my stupid advice and assistance to help them sort out the coal problems. Here's the next headline. Eskom fails to renegotiate coal contracts as it battles to cut costs. So that tells you how successful they've been in trying to reduce the coal costs. A blatant lie again to us, the public. As far as the new CEO is coming, he said that the opportunity was presented to him and it wasn't a job that he applied for to come and make a contribution. So he wants you and me to feel sorry for him. And he says that's the honest truth. The fact of the matter is, when I asked the minister, how come they chose this guy instead of people who got lots of Eskom experience, I was told that he did the best presentation. And he even submitted, look there, ladies and gentlemen, he is the only one who submitted a video as to how good he is and what he's going to do at Eskom. So who's lying here? He says he didn't apply for the job. The minister says, no, he applied and he was the best presentation with a video. And this is the type of lies that you and I cannot fathom. And certainly if people have to lie about small things like this, just imagine how they're lying to you about bigger things. And then, of course, there's other people. They believe he's the great white knight and he's going to fix up Eskom. Mr. Director, you are doing a fine, darn job. From the time you took over, we had a CEO who actually is getting the power system back to the levels of reliability it once enjoyed. Ladies and gentlemen, I've showed you the graphs. You decide who's talking the truth and who's lying to the public. As far as solar as an alternative concern, this is the sort of rule of thumb of what solar is supposed to supply to you, allegedly from about 7 o'clock in the morning till about 6 o'clock in the evening. And that's what they're selling to the people. But that's not the reality. This is what the reality is more likely like. And this is just a snapshot. It's not every day's picture. This is just a snapshot. So there's a big difference between what they're setting up as in terms of reliable power and what is actually happening. And here's another screenshot. And you can see that it only gets to maximum power output around about 12 o'clock and then disappears on that particular day. By 1 o'clock, there was hardly any solar output. So how can you build an economy on unreliable, non-dispatchable power? These are questions you and I must ask as you sit and go home tonight to your family or sitting unemployed and without jobs because there's either not enough power to start new companies or the power is far too expensive. As far as the car power ship thing is concerned, I I don't need to tell you. I'm sure you read the papers and you know that this deal has already been sitting in court because of massive, massive corruption. And anyway, we don't want to pay excessively for another country's ships to come here and then take all our money for 20 years and then disappear with the ship and the power station. There's nothing left behind. We sit with no assets. And the fact of the matter is, I am in favor of emergency power like car power ships, but for no longer than 2 to 3 years. And it's got to be on a transparent basis so that you can see what is going on. And if we need more than 3 years to fix up our energy situation, you must thank the ANC for messing it up, because in 2001, I'll just remind you what I told you just now, the Eskom was the best utility in the world. And from there, we're now in such a dire shape that we need emergency power for more than 20 years. I mean, it's absolutely disastrous. As far as other issues are concerned, Eskom now wants to build batteries to store. Again, they're going to be the guinea pigs of the world. There are no utility-size batteries available anywhere in the world. And yes, they can store gas if they want to go to gas, but that's a long-term exercise and that costs a lot of money. The question is, what should you do? Ladies and gentlemen, all I'm asking you to do is to open up your minds and just to question the stuff that's been poured down your throats from morning to night. And I'm going to now put something in a bit controversial. You need more money to get the energy situation fixed up. South Africa alone needs more than $15 billion. Another $15 billion for our neighboring countries who have been reliant on Eskom since 1923. It's 98 years they've been part and parcel of very cheap power and power that has good availability statistics. And then Eskom still needs to beef up its transmission. The so-called unbundled Eskom needs another 20 billion rand just to fix up the transmission grid and to add to the transmission grid to cater for the new renewables that they want to do. But before I sign off, I'm going to make two comments. The first thing is that renewables on its own has 15% availability as far as wind is concerned. And for that clever professor that says the wind always blows somewhere, he must understand that it's of no use to us if there's no windmill where the wind blows always. I can say the same thing about the sun. The sun shines always on the earth, but it's no use to us if it's not on our solar farms. And solar availability is 30 to 40% on average throughout the year. I'm going to ask you, what are you going to do for energy the other 20 hours? 40% is 4 hours a day. What are you going to do for the other 20 hours a day? How are you going to run our 24/7 business interests in manufacturing, mining, smelting, baking bread? You can't half bake a loaf of bread and switch it off and then come back when the sun comes back or the wind starts blowing again. These are big issues. As far as the climate change is concerned, I'm going to say my last bit, and I'm not going to take any questions on it, but the fact of the matter is, as far as I can see, of the so-called greenhouse gases that everybody's complaining about, 96% of the greenhouse gases is water vapor. All the other gases together, and I'm not in favor of killing myself with poisonous gases, but you must think very seriously about carbon dioxide. The only reason carbon dioxide has been fingered is because it's easily measured. When I was at school, my plants needed carbon dioxide to grow. The farmers that I know of that are doing very well pump carbon dioxide into their tunnels to make the plants grow better. So all I'm asking, I'm going to end up now, is that you must just open your minds and think twice before you believe everything that you hear. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ted. You would, with that particular comment, obviously have fired up some of us who are in the Climate Justice Coalition. But before we call on to the next speaker, I want to just put two questions to you. The first one is in relation to the coal shortage. There were reports in 2019, but also earlier this year, I think around July, there were reports that there is a serious stealing of coal at the mines where trucks come and load coal to Eskom plants. So I want you to tell, or at least to comment on, do you think these people who are stealing this coal and resell it back to Eskom, are they, or may they be linked in any way to any person in the DMRE or in Eskom itself? That is the first question. The second question is, do you think the raider was brought in to facilitate and accelerate the destruction of, Andre the raider was brought in to facilitate and accelerate the destruction of Eskom, creating a precedent for a further privatization and commercialization of the utility itself?
Okay, so I'm going to address the second question first. I'm already in deep trouble legally. I'm not going to make any comments about the rater. All I can say is, as far as I'm concerned, he was not qualified for the job. He has zero energy Eskom experience, and he had zero coal mining and generation experience. I mean, you need metallurgists and engineers, mining engineers and mechanical engineers to understand that business. So he came in with zero relevant experience. Why he was put there and what mandate he got, I can't answer you. I can guess, but I'm already in deep legal trouble with Eskom. There are people wanting to sue the living daylights out of me, and I'm getting myself ready for that fight. As far as the stealing of coal at Eskom is concerned, with the conversion of Eskom in 2001 from an NGO, a non-profit organization, to a for-profit organization, which the ANC thought they can get big dividends from, there has been a total collapse of governance and safeguards. So from 2001, people that are tied to Eskom have been breaching the governance, they've been stealing from Eskom, they've been employing nepotistic relationships. And then just to highlight to you, I mentioned to Eskom, and then I got booted after my contract was terminated, that there's been no weigh bridges at Eskom. They're buying in more than 20% of their coal by truck, as you mentioned. There were no weigh bridges at the time. There's no sampling done. So there's stone and sand and all sorts of rubbish being delivered to the coal power stations. Eskom's power stations were geared to get coal from a conveyor. There are sampling systems on the conveyor. There are no sampling systems on trucks coming in. I know of trucks that come into the gate. They offer the officer at Eskom $50. He gives them a POD, a proof of delivery statement. They don't offload. They go back into the queue and they do 4 or 5 deliveries like that without offloading the coal per day. And that is still ongoing. And then there's also preferential treatment. Certainly, you can go look at the presidential website on the 14th of April 2015. You will see that I made a claim that there are certain people politically affiliated who will get preferential prices for their coal, up to 200 Rand a ton more than anybody else. And you and I are the suckers who are paying these premiums for coal that has no different attributes to anybody else's coal. So yes, you're right. The coal procurement plan of Eskom is a nightmare. It's a disaster. It's been allowed to rot because people are getting fear. I mean, there's even one coal supplier. He's got a special little dump there for sampling purposes. When Eskom comes to sample, he tells them sample from this premium dump. It's a couple of wheelbarrows full. But the real stuff that goes into the power station is not near the quality of that dump. It's all the rubbish you can find and buy up from all over the show. So yes, the reason why Eskom's coal prices are going up is because of preferential treatment. I've just told you the ANC is getting more than 200 Rand and more per ton for their coal since it's 1st of June. And other political players have been getting same preferential stuff since about 2006, 2007 that I'm aware of. I had all this to give to Zondo. People called me and then they canceled the appointment. So I never got to Mr. Zondo's thing. And as far as me having aspirations to running Eskom, it's a lot of nonsense. I don't think one person can fix up Eskom. I offered to Mr. Mabuza, my team. He wanted to know if my team was available. And I got them all, other than one who's got Alzheimer's, they were all available to come. I've been left high and dry. I can't fix up Eskom. It's a team effort. Eskom is too big for one person to think he can fix it up. So there we are. And as far as the climate issues, please forgive me. I'm not going to answer any questions.
Thanks. Okay, thank you, Ted. Let's move to our second speaker. I will call on Comrade Dominic Brown to speak on ESCOM Transformed Full Report. Comrade Dominic, the space is yours.
Thanks, Comrade Trevor, and good morning to everyone. It's good to be here. So I want to disagree with Ted Blom. I think that any discussion around ESCOM must be situated within a context of a massive climate emergency. And the science is really there. When we look at, and it's not just carbon dioxide emissions, there are other harmful gas emissions. And when we look at other periods in history with similar trajectories, we can see the dangerous implications that it may have. And at similar times in history, we see that temperatures were much warmer, making it inhabitable for human beings. Sea levels were almost 20 meters higher than they are today. And in reality, greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, and we are actually running out of time to address the ecological crisis. So I think we have to be clear that the science is there. We've seen raging fires, we've seen droughts, we've seen floods. These occurrences are haven't happened at the scale and frequency that they are happening at the moment in recent history. And I think those things are actually undeniable. And South Africa contributes significantly to this climate emergency and the ecological crisis, being one of the biggest carbon emitters in the world. And Patrick indicated that when you look at it per capita, we even more disproportionately, we contribute even more disproportionately to global emissions. At the same time, we have our own unfolding energy crisis. And there's some aspects here that Ted Blom touches on that I agree with and that I want to speak to in a bit more detail. And of course, I think that we have to be, just like with the climate science, we have to be realistic and scientific about what it's going to take to address the ecological crisis. And here, there's some areas where I would actually agree with Ted. At the moment, the capacity factor, how much actual energy we can get from renewables, is lower than other dispatchable energy. So we have to take this into account if we still want to be able to have energy, which is critical for the development of the economy, but also for the fulfillment of basic needs. But we cannot just look at the ecological and energy crisis in and of itself. We have to put this within the broader context of the socioeconomic crisis that has been unfolding in South Africa, and that's manifested in obviously deep levels of mass unemployment, incompatible levels of inequality, both income and wealth, and more than half the population living below what's known as the upper bound poverty level, which in and of itself is an inadequate measure. And I think it's some of this that helps us to make sense of the massive social unrest that took and unfolded in parts of the country during July this year. Now, these major crises, the intersection of the economic, of the ecological and the social, presents a major opportunity. There's a possibility of trying to deal with both the ecological and the economic, and not either or. And in this way, movements in the country and around the world have been calling for a just transition that has substance. I agree with Ferrial that says there's many references to the just transition that's empty and that is in an attempt to advance the increased liberalization of the energy system. And as AIDC, we developed a publication that says, when we look at the climate crisis, we should also be looking to deal with the massive unemployment crisis. And in this way, we've mapped out areas in where jobs can be created to contribute towards climate mitigation. But now, when we have this discussion, of course, Eskom is at the heart of it, not only because of the frustrations of the rolling blackouts, but because it remains integral to the South African economy, where it produces the majority of the energy produced in the country. And of course, the majority of which comes from the burning of coal. I think more than 80%, although the exact amount is unclear. There's different references, some 85, some 80. And the response is that from key members of government, including the Minister of Public Enterprises, and of course, the CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, amongst others, have been advancing the call to unbundle Eskom as a means of advancing what they call a renewable energy transition and as a pathway to decarbonization. In effect, as I've been saying, this historically is part of a broader process of whether it's unbundling or divisionalization, by the way, it's semantics, about the increased space for the private sector in renewable energy generation in the country. And that included initially the establishment of the renewable energy REI4P, and now most recently with the announcement to increase private renewable energy embedded generation up to 100 megawatts without any licensing. And when we listen to Andre de Ruyter, he makes it quite clear that this is all about increasing the role of the market in energy production, and that the unbundling of Eskom, or its restructuring, or its divisionalization is a key aspect of this. Just a quick side point is to say that the liberalization of the energy sector and unbundling is one of the components of the broader aspects of the restructuring of the South African economy, which amounts to the intensification of a neoliberal economic agenda, which includes major budget cuts in the form of the biggest cuts to non-interest expenditure since 1994, including the cuts to the public sector wage bill, both of which will lead to a further deterioration of services, the further deregulation of markets, the declining in, or the reduction in the corporate income tax rate, and the increased integration into the global economy as a means of driving an export-led growth model. And here, of course, it's the idea of extracting key commodities, of which coal is one, the high-quality coal, and exporting it. Now, this is argued to be good for GDP. In effect, though, we see that this discounts the massive costs, social costs, environmental costs, health costs that are related to extractivism, and that deepen the ecological crisis. The idea of liberalizing the energy sector, the idea that the private sector can lead the transition, buys into this false notion that following the latest releases of the levelized costs of energy, which shows how much it costs to produce different forms of energy at the plant level alone, says that solar is now the cheapest. And because it's the cheapest, automatically there will be more investment going towards it. And as a result, automatically we would see the unfolding of a transition to a low carbon economy globally. This also buys into notions that the problems at Eskom is simply because it's a monopoly, and that the issues of corruption, which needs to be acknowledged, is dislocated or disconnected from the way Eskom operates, the structuring and or the restructuring of Eskom over time, going back to when it was established as a not-for-profit public utility, to its commercialization in the 1980s and corporatization in 2001, which Ted Blom actually indicated was a key issue. And this relates to a problem of needing to sell electricity to the users and recover the full costs, the full cost recovery model, in a situation where the majority of the population is unemployed and unable to afford services. Invariably, you will lead or find that you are unable to cover costs over time. And also in a context where there's been a lack of investment into the development of energy generation between the late 90s and the development of Medupi and Kusile. And all of us are quite aware of the problems that that entailed. Now, in response to this, many unions have come out and said that we are against unbundling. And in so doing, many so-called environmentalists, businesses, etc., are saying, oh, the unions are just defending their self-interest, they're just defending jobs, and they don't care about dealing with the climate crisis. However, when we look at what's happening internationally, we actually see that the unions in this country are probably onto something, and that they may be right, in that when we look at the deregulated market model for renewable energy, it has hit a brick wall. This is not only because notions of the levelized costs of energy are misleading in that it doesn't account for all the costs that would be required to develop a renewable energy industry. Of course, this shouldn't be a barrier to do it. It just means that we need to be honest, as Ted Blom says, about what it's going to take to do so. And when we look at the global energy mix, and there's some people who are critical of it, but I think it can be used as an indicator of changes in relation to where energy production is coming from. And in that, we see that energy produced from wind and solar remains a fraction of the total energy produced globally. And what we actually see is that there's been parallel increases in the level of energy generated from fossil fuels and from renewables. And that's why a report released less than a couple of months ago says the global fossil fuel use is similar to that to a decade ago. What this doesn't say is that we are using more fossil fuels than a decade ago, which has negative implications for the environment. And the problem with the deregulated market model or the for-profit model for renewable energies is based on this simple idea or concept, and that is the threefold effect, okay? So now as the bidding prices for renewable energies are declining, and they have declined significantly, more than 60% for solar PV and more than 80% for wind over the past decade or so. However, the capital expenditure costs, the balancing costs, the grid costs, the profile costs, the system costs have not all decreased at a similar rate. And so what that means is that for the private investors who's dropped bidding prices as a means of trying to capture purchase power agreements, they've undercut themselves in this time. And over time, we're seeing the declining levels or rates of profitability as a result of this, which is also mitigating or disincentivizing investments into renewables. And so the for-profit model is actually putting the transition at jeopardy. It's holding it at ransom. Now, I'm probably running out of time. I've spoken for 15 minutes. So I'm going to wrap up and say that all of this is not to say that we shouldn't transition to renewable energies. All of it is to say that we actually really do need to in the context of a climate emergency. It also is to say that we cannot do it without coupling or using it as a means of addressing deep socioeconomic crisis that's unfolding in the country, including the crisis of joblessness. Now, at AIDC, we are arguing that we should be transforming Eskom, given the central role it plays within the economy, to a fully public renewable energy industry, and in that way lead the transition to decarbonization within the country. And this is as a means to both plan it in an effective way, but also to ensure that we can harness the required resources to be able to finance such a transition. In this regard, beyond implementing greater progressive taxes, as Patrick Bond was alluding to, one key aspect that we are arguing at AIDC is that we need to look at liberating the power of pension funds. And Professor Bond was speaking about the market capitalization of the South African economy and how effectively the JSE is almost 400% of GDP, 4 times the size of the real economy. And this is a big problem. Now, the government employs pension fund, which is under the asset management of the Public Investment Corporation, which has more than 1.8 trillion rand in accumulated reserves, invests more than 2/3 of these assets into the JSE, which contributes significantly to the overfunding and the bloating of the stock exchange within the country. So the argument is that you are propping up finance capital at the expense of the public, at the expense of workers and the majority of people in the country. And this fund grows between 40 to 50 billion rand each year. And so rather than continuing to bloat up the financial economy, we ought to redirect some of these finances to invest in the transforming of Eskom into this fully public renewable energy utility. And of course, this can be a way in which that we can fast track transition to a low carbon economy. The last thing I would say is beyond these technical arguments and the need to get realistic about what it's going to take to decarbonize in South Africa and globally, this is not simply a technical or a academic argument. Ultimately, this is a question of power, going back to the first panel discussion, a question of capital and fighting the power of capital in the unfolding context. This is going to require the coming together of all workers and social movement forces under a common platform to demand that we advance a just transition from below. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic. Let me pose 2 questions, and the panelists and other attendees must forgive me for not being strict on time, especially with the first speaker, but I would request that the 2 questions I would ask you just briefly provide answers to them, and then we move to Alex Lenferna. The first question is in relation to the liberalization of the energy sector. Do you think this is in conjunction, the liberalization of the energy sector? Do you think it is a continuation of the accelerated agenda towards the restructuring of state-owned enterprises, which was envisioned in 2002, but of course was late, its foundation was laid in the white paper, energy white papers, which was published in 1998. Do you think this is such a moment where there's an acceleration for that particular privatization of state-owned enterprises? The second one is one which I think in the labor movement and in the climate and environmental movement, there might sometimes even be misunderstandings. And I think you referred to it a little bit, that sometimes those in the environmental and climate movement may think that the people in labor are merely concerned with ensuring that they secure jobs for their members, whereas and at the expense of climate and at the expense of the environment. So I want this question directly emanating out of that. I want you to perhaps just give few comments on how can we balance the just transition that it, at the same time, whilst it is in the interest of preserving climate and environment, it also does not simultaneously lead to job losses.
So I'll try and be 2 minutes, 2 minutes. So the first thing in terms of, yes, this is the intensification of the liberalization of state-owned enterprises. Unlike in the late 90s, early 2000s, the trade union movement is fragmented and weak. And unfortunately, a lot of progressives are actually supporting the unbundling of Eskom as a means of providing renewable energies, which is, I think, short-sighted and may actually lead to deepening inequalities in the long run. So that, and moreover, would probably be inimical, a barrier to achieving decarbonization, to transitioning to a low carbon economy and addressing the ecological crisis. I think I was just over a minute there. The second question is on jobs and workers. Now in 2011, 2012, the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa came out and said, we need socially owned renewable energy. I think Enos is here. There's many others who can speak to that. Ruth and Plukotse, many from NUMSA knows this issue quite well. Unfortunately, I feel that the trade, and I'm a big supporter of the trade union movement. We haven't been as proactive. I say we haven't been proactive as in saying it's not just about jobs. We're getting real about the ecological crisis. So we haven't done enough to say what socially owned renewable energy is meant to be and how it can be achieved. And I think this is where Eskom, the idea of pulling together Eskom Transformed comes in. It was about bringing together a convergence of NUMSA, SAFTU, working with trade unions for energy democracy and ourselves at AIDC to be able to put together something that's realistic for South Africa, that doesn't deny that we have a climate problem, but it also recognizes that we can't just fall into this idea that the for-profit model for renewable energies is the solution. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Comrade Trevor.
Thanks, Comrade Dominic. Let me, without wasting time, move to Comrade Lenferna. Comrade Alex, the space is yours. You'll be speaking on the green new energy, of course, transforming Eskom, green industrialization, the 18 points vision, which the Climate Justice Coalition had put forth. The space is yours, Com.
Thank you very much, Comrade Trevor, and greetings, comrades. It's good to be with you all. I just want to start by addressing Ted Blom's comment about the climate change not being real. So I really think we can't stand for those sorts of comments in this space, comrades. I did study a PhD on climate change energy, and I've studied the science, and the scientists across the world are in overwhelming agreement that the climate change crisis is real, is human caused. You know, like the tobacco industry spread misinformation saying that smoking doesn't cause cancer, so the fossil fuel industry spreads misinformation saying greenhouse gases don't cause climate change. And just as we should be inviting tobacco lobbyists or those that work for the tobacco industry to talk about things like, you know, health, so I think we also shouldn't be giving platform to those that deny climate change and echo these sorts of climate denial points of talking that the fossil fuel industry has been putting out through intense propaganda efforts to protect their profits at the expense of people on the planet. So I think it's just, yeah, we can't tolerate that sort of climate denial. Anyway, I'm gonna turn to my presentation after that. So thanks, comrade. This is about the Green New Eskom campaign that is being run by the Climate Justice Coalition. And you know, when we think about the climate crisis, it's really vital that we think about Eskom because Eskom is the biggest polluter on the entire African continent, right? And hopefully you can all see my slides now. And you can find out more about the campaign at greenueskom.org. And these slides are also from the booklet that we put out around the Green New Eskom campaign. So the campaign itself, you know, is partly informed by some of the critiques that have been laid out in the likes of Dominic's the booklet around, you know, an Eskom transformed, and it's brought together by the Climate Justice Coalition, which is over 30 different civil society organizations. The trade union SAFTU is a member. There is grassroots organizations, those struggling for energy justice, mining affected communities. There are climate justice organizations, health justice organizations that are all part of this coalition that has come together to push forward this Green New Eskom campaign. And as Trevor mentioned, there's sort of an 18-point demand list that outlines the sort of vision that we have for transforming Eskom, but also for transforming the broader energy sector as part of that. I won't go through each and every one of those 18 demands, but they are available if you want to dive into more detail. But at the heart of the campaign, we're calling for a Green New Eskom, right? And the central demand around that kind of ties that vision together is a rapid and a just transition to a more socially owned, renewable energy powered economy that provides clean, safe, and affordable energy for all, with no worker and community left behind in the transition. So this is how we've distilled the demands in the campaign into one central core demand that ties that together. I think we all know, and has been pointed out by both Ted Blom and Dominic, that Eskom is in deep trouble. You know, it's got a reliance on unreliable, aging, and expensive coal power plants that have been mismanaged, that haven't been properly maintained. As a result, we're getting plunged into load shedding and load reduction. It's deep in debt. There's incredible corruption and mismanagement, and it is the biggest polluter on the continent, right? So Eskom really is at a point where it's a bit on a precipice. And I think it is a real vital moment for us to fight for an Eskom that works for all. We know that state-owned enterprises, when corruption and mismanagement hurts them, the people that it hurts the most is the working class and it's the poor. And so functional state-owned enterprises are key to delivering for our people. Now, one of the key elements in our discussion around the Green New Eskom campaign is to try and flip the narrative that blames the crisis of debt in Eskom on municipalities and in poor communities. You know, there's this quote from Malcolm X that says, if you're not careful, the media will have you loving the oppressors and hating the oppressed. And I think that's what Eskom and the government has done so well, is to try flip the blame for the debt crisis onto the poor who aren't able to pay. And this graph from our booklet puts things into a little bit of perspective to show how it's very much the other way around. So if you look at the bottom of this graph here, you can see the debt that municipalities owe to Eskom is by far the smallest piece there. And that's, you know, about 35 billion or so. And, you know, we work in the coalition with groups like the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee that are a central part of the coalition. And they, for this small chunk of debt, they're often blamed for Eskom's problems. But if you compare it to these other sizes, you'll see that the debt is much bigger elsewhere. So Kusile and Medupi were initially projected to cost 60 billion, but their projected total cost is going to be closer to 500 billion, according to some estimates of the forecast when they're fully complete, right? And so that's a cost overrun that itself is about 10 times the municipal debt that is earned, just 2 coal power plants, right? And we can look to the load shedding crises and some of the corruption that's been driven around them in terms of the overpriced coal contracts. So there was a special investigative unit to report in 2019 that showed after the 2008 load shedding crisis, that was used as an excuse to sign on overpriced coal contracts to the value of 14 trillion rand, right? And so that vastly outweighs the municipal debt that is owed to Eskom. In fact, if anything, the municipal debt that is owed to Eskom is a symptom of these problems. It's as a result of communities being unable to afford the increase in electricity costs that came because of these decisions. And you can see here, in 2007, once this load shedding begins to get implemented with the building of Kusile and Medupi, the price of electricity is going up and up and up, right? So it's important that we put the blame where it's due. At the same time that the cost of coal and corrupt coal contracts has gone up, we have seen the reality that the cost of renewable energy have shot down significantly. If we'd spoken about this 10 years ago, we would have said that renewable energy is more expensive to build, but now it is by far the lowest form of energy, right? And of course, you can't just think about the least cost, the cost of energy of production. We need to think, as Dominic points out, at a system level. What investments do we need in the grid? What investments do we need in the transmission, in storage? But the thing is, even if you look at that analysis of system-wide energy costs, right, there are many different reports from various different energy experts and modelers that show that actually a renewable energy powered system is the most affordable system for South Africa's future. And so part of this myth that renewable energy is unreliable, that's the wrong way to think about it. It's variable energy. Yes, it doesn't always come at one time, but if you invest in the right sorts of storage and the right sorts of grid infrastructure, that variable energy can be integrated into a reliable energy system. And that's what economic modelers, that's what energy experts, and that's what real world evidence from countries that are pursuing incredible renewable energy programs have shown. You know, we have countries that are far more advanced than us in terms of renewable energy and storage, and that are implementing utility scale storage solutions as well as transmission that can connect it. There is big challenges, and we need to ensure that Eskom has the finances it needs to invest in this, and that the private sector isn't getting an indirect subsidy by parasiting off Eskom's investment in transmission. But it's really important that we do recognize the reality that a renewable energy future is indeed the most economic one for South Africa, right? And it's also the one that would create more jobs, relative to one that's heavy on coal and nuclear and gas, right? It's the fastest way for us to bring an end to load shedding, and it would make our energy system more reliable. And of course, we remove our biggest source of pollution, the one that contributes so significantly to climate change. But I think the Green New Eskom campaign is not just about transitioning to renewable energy. It is about, at the heart of it, what Ferrial calls a deep, just transition. And I think we know that here in South Africa, what we are experiencing is kind of more of just a transition. It's not a just transition. It is dominated by multinational corporations that have got the majority of the privatized contracts through the EI4P procurement program. And there isn't protection in place for workers and communities as we transition away from coal. So we've got just a transition that's maintaining the status quo. And so we need to put in place at least the protective just transition, which ensures that workers and communities aren't left behind, those that are dependent on coal and related sectors. But beyond that, we need a transformative just transition, one that uses the transformations in the energy sector to ensure that there's deep justice and that we're empowering communities and empowering workers so that they're the ones who benefit and earn from this new renewable energy future. And I want to show this particular picture. I think we in the trade union movement are quite familiar with the idea of social ownership. It's whether it's run by worker cooperatives, communities, citizens, and municipalities, and also through state-owned entities like Eskom, right? And the aim of that is really to bring the benefits of energy, the ownership of them, to the people and less to profit from multinational corporations. Now, if you look at this picture a little closer, you can see there's a lot of white faces there. And that's kind of a purposeful inclusion, because what you see in places in Europe and the like is that there is more social ownership of energy, right? But here in South Africa, what we have instead is multinational corporations, often based in Europe, that are the ones driving our energy sector. And so this is kind of like a neo-colonization of our energy sector. First, they took our resources and extracted our wealth. Now they're extracting profits from our sun and wind. And I think we need to ask why we don't have more social ownership in South Africa and why we aren't more vigorously fighting for it. And then another element of the Green New Eskom campaign is really pushing for the green industrialization. We talked about the 1 million climate jobs program. And it is true that renewable energy does produce more jobs per unit invested in it. But if we really want to unlock the most jobs in the renewable energy sector, it's about ensuring that the production of renewables, of components, is based more in South Africa. And we need to fight hard for that. That's where the majority of the job creation can be if we fight for it. Alternatively, what we have now is the import of sort of lowest cost renewables, often from places like China, where there is super labor exploitation and very low environmental standards. And so this supply chain justice and the green industrialization has to be a central point of struggle for us in this campaign. And then, because I think I'm going a little bit over time, I want to end by thinking about what it means to be sufficiently ambitious in this space. And the scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the world's leading body that brings together scientists from across the world, have issued a report telling us what needs to be done for us to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That 1.5 degrees Celsius target is one that has been fought for by African nations, by nations of the global south, by small island nations like my home country of Mauritius, and all the climate vulnerable countries, the global marginalized communities, because we realize that if we push past 1.5 degrees Celsius, we move into catastrophic climate change, which threatens to unravel the progress, little progress we've made on development, and threatens our livelihoods, our lives, and threatens everything that we know in terms of what it means to live in this world in a way that's prosperous and that allows us to create a more socially and ecologically just future. So the scientists have told us what needs to be done to get there. We need to cut our emissions pretty much to zero within the next couple of decades. And the energy sector has to be the engine for decarbonizing the rest of the economy, right? And so for South Africa, what that means, according to analysis, is that our energy sector must phase out coal by 2033 and be fully decarbonized by 2035 to 2040. That might sound very aggressive to many of the comrades in the room in terms of the speed, but if you speak to some of the young people that we work with in the Climate Justice Coalition, they're calling for even faster than that because it's their future on the line. You know, this 1.5 degree target in the future, you know, it's important, but the reality is that the climate emergency is here and now. And every year of delay means that we're condemning our children and condemning ourselves to a devastated climate crisis. Our young people are calling for something much more ambitious. And I think as the trade union movement, there hasn't been a true reckoning with the speed and the scale of the transformation that the climate science is telling us we need to undertake. But as Comrade Zwelinzima Vavi has pointed out, for any of this transformation to occur, we need profound socioeconomic transformation to be at the heart of it. And so we are faced with a dual transformation imperative in South Africa. On one hand, we have an exploitative minerals energy complex, which has made us one of the most unequal and polluting countries in the world. And so we've got to tackle that inequality and the legacies of apartheid that still stay there. And then on the second side, we have the climate crisis, which is telling us we need to transform our economies across every sector. And if we can bring together those transformation imperatives and bring it together in a transformative eco-socialist vision, then I think we could take on the crisis at the scale and speed that needs to be. So thanks, comrades. That's the vision of the Green New ESCOM that we have. There's more details available on the website and the booklet. Feel free to dive into it more. We've been hosting workshops across the country. You're welcome to invite us if you'd like to engage in more detail. We can't cover it all in 10 minutes. And there's a lot of elements on the website where you can take action and learn more, including the booklet, which is at greenuescom.org/learn. So thank you, comrades, and looking forward to the discussions.
Thanks, Comrade Alex. I will proceed because we are a little bit over time, or even more over time. I would proceed to invite questions from the participants. And I realize that there is, I will call on Comrade, I'll call on Comrade Roland from RLS, Rosa-Luxemburg, to put some of the questions that he had written through the chat room verbally, but also call on Comrade Brian to put some of the questions through also. Comrade Roland.
Yes, thank you, Comrade Trevor. I was a bit, well, very disappointed with Ted's presentation, which was really kind of dark and long criticism and all of that. I think there's something that he doesn't seem to realize in the first part of his presentation, the fact that you had over 20 million Black South Africans that needed to be connected to the grid. And that could have led to the collapse of the manufacturing and so on that he spoke about. And also he doesn't really bring the vision for the new ESCOM that we want. Again, it's good that Alex and spoke at length about the potential for wind and solar and the green new ESCOM that we are all looking for, and which the AIDC also brought to the fore. And it would be really nice to get something out of this presentation if Alex can really talk a lot more about the green new ESCOM that we want, first of all, and secondly, the kind of transformations that we can have within communities if we have more community participation in this green capacity that we are looking for.
Thanks, Roland. Comrade Brian.
Thank you, comrades. Unfortunately, I missed Ted Blom's presentation, so I won't speak to that. On this last presentation, many questions really, but I would, listening to both Dominic and Alex, I'm curious about when you say more socially owned renewables, are you distinguishing yourself from what Comrade Dominic is saying by talking about publicly owned through ESCOM? So does the green new ESCOM oppose unbundling? And are you thinking about centrally publicly owned by ESCOM? And so tied to that, I'm curious about, are there any nations that exist currently that you would identify as matching the climate ambitions that you prescribe in terms of the use of wind and solar? Based on that, there are some other follow-up questions around other complementary energy resources I'd be curious to get your opinion on. But if you can give me some practical examples of what nations you have in mind that have high penetrations of wind and solar, what their cost of electricity is, and do they match your ambition? Or are there any examples that match that ambition? Thank you.
Thanks. Comrade Alex, may you answer to the questions posed?
Yeah, sure thing. So in terms of the social ownership, very much it's about ESCOM as a public utility, investing in renewables, investing in storage and transmission. So that's all part of that vision. There is, in addition, the call for many within the coalition for community-owned renewable energy as an element of social ownership, right? So I think, with Dominic's presentation, it is very much laser focused on ESCOM as being, a public utility that drives it. And we want ESCOM to be driving it, but also allowing for broader ownership of renewable energy beyond that, right? And so that's the position that the coalition is taking on that particular element. And then in terms of countries that have the right solar and wind penetration, so I would have to look at an analysis in terms of cost of electricity, in terms of right penetration versus cost, right? So I don't have that off the top of my head, but we know that there's many other countries that have gone much further than South Africa has in terms of the penetrations of wind and solar, and countries that have much less favorable renewable conditions, whether that's places like Britain, which has run many days without coal, places like Germany, Australia. And in terms of matching stated ambition, when we're thinking about getting to 100% renewable energy, I think that's something that all countries need to be moving much faster on. So, that's something that is an aspiration for the future, but there are countries that are at 100% renewables. A lot of them are quite reliant on hydropower to help make that happen, but there is increasingly those that are moving to a solar and wind dominated future. And, the economic modeling does suggest that a wind and solar dominated energy future would be, the lowest cost way of meeting those sorts of more ambitious targets. So hopefully that helps. Thanks.
Yeah, but I think he feels that you didn't answer the other part of his question, which was that the green new energy is the green new energy opposed to unbundling of ESCOM?
So is the coalition as opposed to unbundling? Yeah, I think many members within the coalition are opposed to unbundling. I can't speak for every single member in the coalition, but yeah, the privatization and bundling of Eskom is something that many of the members are opposed to.
Thank you very much. I think this would bring us to the end of the session. I'm not sure if I should invite Professor Patrick Bond, because when Ted made his submissions and contributions, he referred to the fact that you cannot bake a half bread waiting for wind to come. So I'm not sure if Prof would want to have any contribution there.
I think it's a great challenge for us all, dear comrades. I really reject much of what Ted Blom is all about. He opposes redistribution, for example, in the pricing system. So poor and working class people get cheaper electricity. That kind of justice is foreign to Ted. And I think his ideas about climate put him into a lunatic fringe. However, he is making a good point that we need to figure out storage. And there is a storage strategy. And I think comrades might have heard that you can pump the water uphill. And that's what's happening in the Drakensberg, right? And also a little bit in Cape Town. And that way at night, when the sun doesn't shine or if the wind isn't blowing, you can bring it back down. Another storage strategy is what they're using in the Northern Cape, which is molten salt. That keeps the salt hot, so you can keep turbines running for 9-10 hours, even after the sun has gone down. So there are strategies that will address this and the so-called baseload. It's revealing that Germany, for example, has a huge industrial output and some days runs on 100% renewable. What I'd love to see is a really big commitment for no intellectual property rights from the north on things like the tidal energy in the ocean. And of course, we're going to need more offshore wind, where the wind is very, very strong in this country. And that's what Joe Biden even announced yesterday. So what I know about the technology is, I think something we can address, we can work with. A socialist strategy, one in which Eskom is really worker controlled, could then dedicate resources, the vast resources, the 500 billion or so that Alex mentioned was going to Medupi. Think how much we could have done to make our economy absolutely future-proofed had we had different leadership and not the corrupt Hitachi Chancellor House Gupta to ANC combination that's there. Anyway, I'm happy to be debating Ted anytime, but I do think he does occupy an area where we have to look very carefully at his allegations, because they come from a white male, wealthy coal-based perspective. And I think we have to move on from that to the 21st century. Thanks, comrades.
Thanks. This brings us to an end of our session. We are going to break for 5 minutes and thereafter we'll reconvene for the last session. Thank you. Back to you, Comrade Matthew.
Okay, greetings everyone, and welcome back. We're going to get started shortly. Just want to double check that we have both Comrades Enos and Sean back at their computers or whatever they're connecting with. Sean is good, thanks Sean. Enos, just check that you are back in. Fantastic, thanks comrades. Okay, so let's carry on. This is our last panel before we move for our last question and answer session, and then some closing remarks. This panel, comrades, will focus on, I am, for those of you who don't know, Matthew Grant. I'm SAFTU's Research and Policy Coordinator. And our last panel will be focusing on trade unions, a local and global perspective of climate change. We have 2 presenters. We have Enos Mbodi from NUMSA, who's a shop steward, but also a commissioner in the Presidential Climate Commission. And we have with us Comrade Sean Sweeney, who's from Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, or TUED. And he will focus more on the 26th session of the Conference of the Polluters or Parties and International Trade Union Perspective on the Climate Crisis. That'll bring us to our last input. So I think without further ado, let us go straight to you, Comrade Enos. Do you want to present? If you do, you can share your screen or you can do your presentation to to share. Thank you very much. Over to you, Enos. Just unmute.
Oh, yes. Thank you so very much for the opportunity. And thank you to all other presenters who presented before me. And I am not going to put up a presentation. I will talk through my speaking notes that I've prepared on the subject matter. And firstly, as I lay the foundation, let it be known that NUMSA doesn't have a difficulty in understanding the issues of climate change. Actually, the debate of whether we should debate about it or not, it is water under the bridge. We are no longer debating whether we should do something about climate change. But where the focus is to make sure that there is inclusivity of the working class, the poor and the working class. It is not only the struggle, shop floor struggle that we're focusing in. As I speak through my notes, let me also appreciate Dominic, Comrade Dominic and Comrade Alex for what they've presented. And you see, when you want to talk about climate change, for us in South Africa, for instance, you will not be doing a great job if you do not build on the socio-economic challenges that we face as this society, as this nation. We have got high numbers of unemployment, high numbers of poverty. I mean, we are afflicted by 63% the last time I checked of poverty. That is a huge amount of people who are living in poverty and inequality. And the reason why you need to lay the foundation on that is because you cannot try to sort out the issues of climate, excluding the three challenges that we need to deal with. So when you deal with these things, you need to find a balance. So there is no denialism, there is no debating science, but there is focus on making sure that socio-economic challenges are addressed as they should be addressed. And the second point is, we do understand that this is not only a shop floor activity, it is societal, it is class related. So there is no way you can be able to separate between the shop floor and the struggles in the society. And it is very, very important that we segment ourselves as a class that makes sure that the transition works in our favor. So let me put it this way. Climate change is a challenge that all of us need to release. Probably what we need to be doing is to make sure that the speed, the pace, and how we're doing it is inclusive. Fully inclusive would mean the engagements should be such that there is nothing granular that is left for chance. So each and every other thing that needs to be debated, to be talked of, insofar as just energy transition, because just energy transition talks to climate change largely, because when you talk of climate change in South Africa, you look at Eskom, you look at the energy sector, and you see who is polluting the most, and you try to work out a way that should be just. According to the definition, there should be justice, nobody should be left outside, everybody should be included, but it shouldn't be academic. It should be such that there is meaningful engagement and there is no exclusion of anybody. The shop floor struggles need to merge or marry the struggles of the communities, because the communities, this is where we come from as we go to work. And there is a relationship, synergical relationship that we need to harness. So these are the challenges that we face. What we face is a very big challenge. When you go, just remember that the trade unions operate on members. The members are driving the organizations. The organizations, trade unions are not supposed, this one that I am in is not driven merely by leadership. I mean, it is driven by members. And so as to make my point insofar as what is the difficulty that we face, we have got very bad experiences. Going on right now is a strike in in the engineering sector. But there is a replication of the sameness of how the employer is dealing with us. So when you're dealing with climate change, you are dealing with climate change amidst all these challenges. And when you want to go to the workers, like if you were to go and address the workers that are in the picket line, their focus is so much that they be a resolution of their strike. And I know of many other sectors within our trade union who have not been very happy and are still trying to finalize their bargaining challenges. So you need to make sure that you remember that there is this focus that we are driven to make sure that the workers have got good conditions of service, salaries and decent jobs. We try to protect that, but at the most, we would want to find a balance. And it is not very, very easy to find a balance when there are vested interests all over the show dealing with the same issue. It is a very difficult space for the trade union to navigate because we are part of the society. We have got shop floor experience that is not palatable. And as we go to our homes, we find things that are facing us that needs us to resolve. So to find the balance is a difficult thing, but it's a challenge worth taking hands on. And this is basically what we are doing right now. And also, just so as to finalize my point of the challenges that we face, we have got a manufacturing sector that is not performing to the best of what is expected of it in terms of the GDP and also in terms of job creation. So because you've got job losses, you've got unemployment, you've got poverty, you've got inequalities, you also need to look at that and say, as and when presentations comes up and say jobs will be created, you want to look exactly where they will be created. It is not so much that we are in denial, we are denying the presentations that we see about certain targets, certain amount of jobs that would be created. But we would want to be as pragmatic as possible. All of us, not only us, we have to be pragmatic and practical as possible so that we may be able to sell this to the workers so that the understanding of this issue of climate change may meet their needs in terms of securing decent jobs and such. So are the challenges dire or there are better solutions? I want to argue that there are better solutions. Part of those better solutions is to make sure that we guard the true meaning of just energy transition and its application. Because it's one thing to have just energy transition clearly defined according to presentations, according to research documents and other body of works. But it is important to make sure that the application of just energy transition is not stolen away from its meaning. And we do believe that the other thing that could be done well is to make sure that we have got a just energy transition blueprint, which actually means that there should be the country's just energy transition, out of which the sectors would build their own smaller contextualized responses to the main. At the moment, we don't have that. We may be having frameworks and things like that, but what we need is a blueprint which we are trying to push to get that going. In the Presidential Commission, we have got a very good working relationship with the civil movements, civil societies, and we're trying to make sure that the things that are a misnomer be corrected. We need to have a just energy transition that will be countrywide just energy transition, that out of which would have contextualized sector just energy transition. And so also, I think what needs to happen in the places where there are discussions of contextualized just energy transition, we need to have a very strong voice of the trade unions there, because otherwise this is going to be stolen. It can be that the debate about just energy transition and what to do with climate change finds itself in secluded spaces. it should be found everywhere where there are people, where people are affected. And because of course we are all affected by climate change, but there is the effect of job losses, which we need to address. We need to create pathways that are clearly addressing what would happen when we lose jobs, what happens when we create jobs, so how much do we lose, and what do we do? What are the pathways? For example, the issue of pathways without oversimplifying. For instance, you would look at those that are, it is easier for people that by natural attrition are going on pension. You can be able to know where would they be at what time. So it needs to be a deliberate attempt to make sure that everybody that is in the coal mining sector and also in the power stations, for instance, must have a very, very clear pathway that talks to exactly what will happen to the jobs, because otherwise you will keep everybody worried and anxious. And also you will begin to create doubts about exactly what is being done. Is it the issue of climate change, or is it an issue of doing away with jobs and just leaving a vacuum unaddressed? So as I close on the second question that was given to me, they should really be an effective and inclusive transition. Let me just make an example. There are other sectors that are building their own just energy transition, what I call, they've contextualized it without the main or the blueprint being available. So if you look at what they are doing, you'll find that there is less and less of the voice of trade union, simply because people are looking at the interest, vested interest on their side, and they go and sell it wherever they sell it. I do understand that as we deal with this issue, we should really be inclusive. It can't be that as trade unions will stand up and just only speak for shop floor. That's why we have got a socially owned renewable sector. We are not saying a worker owned or a shop steward owned, but we are saying socially owned, which exactly mean one of the two things. I mean, it can mean the ESCOM that is transformed, like the comrades have indicated, or community owned, socially owned renewable sector. So there should be an effective transition that is fully inclusive. Right now, we are in doubt that it is as inclusive as it should be. What can we do in order to make sure that we protect the vulnerable, the poor and the vulnerable? Firstly, I think what needs to happen, we need to have, because there are other lessons that have been learned, both, I think, internationally. We should have a peer-to-peer connection with trade unions that have already experienced or that are experiencing just energy transition. Let's have an understanding what is happening. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We need to all work together to make sure that we are also inclusive of views other than ours. And so society also, we have got a very good working relationship, really, but we can do better in making sure that we also have firm up the relationship between trade unions and civil movements, so that the poor and the working class are located in the space where we are. The majority of the people that we represent, their voice should be solid and be found to be solid. One way of protecting them is to make sure that wherever it is possible to help with the community-owned, socially owned renewable sector, it should be done. It shouldn't be that it becomes only good in paper and be left for NUMSA to explain and understanding. All the people who have understood the socially owned renewable sector, we should work together to make sure that we protect, we become a net for the poor and the working class. And I see an attempt, and I think it can be better, to make sure that the social impacts in places which are impacted be looked at deeply. And the presidential climate change commissioners from civil movements and from trade unions have agreed that we need to go granular and make sure that we understand each and every bit and piece of what are the social impacts and how are the mitigations for that. And lastly, we can't avoid the fact that when jobs are in line, whether for good or for bad reason, we should be able to stand up and say, decent jobs is what we are about, not precarious jobs. So whoever is producing the jobs in paper should remind themselves that trade unions are about decent jobs. Simply because those decent jobs are the ones that helps us to alleviate the challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. We are not at a place where we can say we've alleviated poverty, we've alleviated unemployment and inequality, but at least we may not be found saying, let's fix the ecological challenges or climate challenges and forget that we have got other challenges that we need to solve at the same time with climate change. So those are the things that, that we think, in order to deal with the vulnerability of the poor and the working class, their voice must be heard. We do understand that by the nature of people that get involved in these debates, you find that the tone, the texture of the presentation, sometimes even the terminology exclude a huge array of our people, the definitions. Those things are the nitty-gritties that needs to be worked into what it would mean to have a meaningful engagement with people that are affected, without making it elitist, without making it about the educated or the high-willed, because there are also people who are affected and impacted who can't read or write. We need to find a way to make sure that there is a net around this being communicated and them communicating back, and also have social, we need to have a social protection going. We should have social compacts that are sound, which are not only good in paper. Let me stop here, Chairperson, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Comrade Enos. A rich input from trade union perspective side. Before I get to, I see there's a question. Before I just wanted to draw out 2 points that I think you made quite well amongst the many other points. The one was the need for meeting the climate change challenges and the socioeconomic challenges head on, both of them, with a mobilized working class, and also your point about within different sectors in which workers are working, producing the goods of the world, there might be specific challenges within that sector. You mentioned manufacturing. There's also engineering sector, of course, where obviously workers themselves will be producing a lot of the renewable energies. And the actual physical towers that are required, the blades for the wind turbines, all of that. And it's a real need to both speak to general challenges facing the working class, employed, unemployed, globally as a whole, and those needs within that specific sector. That itself can be a very difficult balance, like you're talking about balances. So it was a very good point. Thank you very much for that. Let me go to a question that is coming from Roland from RLS again. I'll just read it out for the comrades. Comrade Mbodi, the criticism that workers often get is because just transition debates are dominated by academics, unions are underrepresented. Workers are already affected by climate change. They understand that it is real. So how do unions organize to make sure that workers' perspectives are front and center, and so that they are the first in the queue for the green jobs that we're all talking about? If you could speak to that. Thanks, comrade.
Definitely a good point. And what we should do, and we wouldn't want it to be very narrow. We would want it to be wherever there is impact, trade unions, whether they're in the manufacturing sector or not, they really should think about the poor and the working class and make sure that those that are in the shop floor, for instance, they may not be left outside. What we are doing practically, insofar as places like Omati and other places where the power stations are closing down, and minds, we are making sure that the people that are there get to be engaged. And the solutions that comes out of any engagement must not come from the top to the bottom. It should be that there are people that are in the space who get engaged at the level where they are. So we know it can be regional, because look, the power stations, most likely you find them in Mpumalanga, which exactly means that you need to have leaders that are involved. You need to know the names of people who are involved in each and every engagement that talks about just energy transition or transition to a low fossil, a trajectory. So, and to make sure that there is direction with regards to where they are going with it. We wouldn't want a polarized, not polarized, a view that walks away from the fact that we are no longer debating climate change science. We would want to talk about how to include them in pathways, developing pathways, how to involve them in making sure that the ghost towns they should be alternative economic activity. And we should make sure that both the civil movement and the trade unions are actually having people and voices, not only the emblems and the t-shirts, but people who know what they are talking about, who understand what they're talking about, who are making necessary input wherever it is needed. So I think, by and large, I would answer it in that way, Comrade Matthews.
Thank you, Comrade Enos. Before I move over to Sean, I think one point that leads us straight into that, into Sean's presentation, was the point you made about that peer-to-peer contact between trade unions, for example, in the developing world like ours, and those in the developed world who have had success in fighting those climate challenge battles in the workplace, affecting their members and affecting their communities. It's a very important point. And how we then, the question would be, translate those challenges into our context and environment, where those challenges are the same, if not augmented, and also very different, where we have such massive amounts of unemployment and inequality that make those challenges that much more difficult. So it's a very, very good point. I'd like to hand over straight to Sean. Thank you very much. Sean?
Thanks, Matthew. Good to see Enos and other comrades who I know and respect immensely on this call. I'm calling you from the UK. I'm preparing with Scottish and other UK-based unions for the climate conference coming up in Glasgow. In a moment, I'm going to share my screen and show a few slides, but I just wanted to say a few things about that conference and what's happening, because it will be in the news. And I've heard comments, which I thoroughly understand, in this conversation today, saying it's a conference of polluters and nothing's going to come of it. And I concur with that assessment. But I also think we need to have a deeper analysis about what's going on, because we can say, well, it's capitalism and it's about growth and it's about profit. That is also true. But I think we need to zoom in on the Achilles heel of the system at the moment is the climate crisis, more than even any other crisis. And I include COVID and other crises, because the poor have been with us for a very long time and there have been many destitute people. But the difference between this particular crisis is it basically affects everybody and there is no escape from it unless it's resolved. So this in many ways is the Achilles heel of the system of trying to address, we need to address the climate emergency and the breakdown of ecosystems. But in terms of the trade union approach, I'm going to show some slides now, which trying to show that there's actually a division in the international trade union movement around the climate debate, and a division between those who recognize it's real and we need to do something about it. But the division comes in terms of what is there, what can be done about it. And I wanted to try to address that point, because in Glasgow, there will be unions inside the conference and active outside the conference. and they will be putting forward different perspectives. And I want to address that now and help comrades get some clarity about it and open up some discussion. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see if we can do that. I see a PowerPoint. Excuse me 1 second. Comrades. Close that. Sorry about the noise. There's construction going on next door. Can comrades see that?
No, can't see it, Sean.
Not
okay.
Not yet, Sean. Just try again.
Screen. Let's try again. If you can help talk me through this. I'm always a bit slow with this, to be honest.
No worries.
Sean, it's
share
Patrick.
screen icon.
Here we go.
You can find a blue feature around. Ah, there you got it. Good.
I think I got it. And then we play from the start. Is that right? You are screen sharing. So if I go slideshow here, do you see that? Do you see that?
Yes.
Good. So you see.
Is that your first slide?
That's the first slide. Yeah.
Great.
I didn't put a title on it. Okay. So what this shows is the various political agreements and commitments made now for really going back to the starts in earnest in the late 70s. And then you see the Earth Summit of 1992, where there was, sorry about this noise, comrades, it's a drilling going on next door. And so what you see is that the emissions continue to rise and in different regions of the world. And the commitments made by the elites basically are having no effect on emissions at all. They just completely continue to rise. Now, this raises the question of what do we mean by a just transition? In the work we've done with the left unions, including NUMSA, SAFTU, and others around the world, we talk about that the just transition has to sort of basically confront the failures of the market approach. And importantly, we have to push back against the idea that the transition is happening and all we need to do is speed it up. This is very, very prevalent in the debates at the global level. And a lot of unions believe that to be true, but it's not true. So this is important to grasp that reality, and Transnational Institute and Trade Unions for Energy Democracy have updated that analysis, and there will be a report coming out very soon on the idea of the energy transition myth and the failure of neoliberal policy. I'm just going to try and close the chat box in a second, but so here's the sort of what I would call the one position, which is the mostly unions in the global north have taken, is that they sort of accepted the analysis that the transition is inevitable and that workers need to be protected. Those in coal, those in heavy industry, those in aviation, or whatever it may be, need to be protected with various packages of support, a safety net for workers. Now my slides are complete. Oh, here we go. Now, what's going on ideologically behind the scenes? This is a picture from the Treaty of Rome, and where this is where coming out of World War II, the unions were much more powerful in Europe, in North America in particular, and they took the view that the elites basically conceded that there was a thing called social partnership, that unions and governments and employers could work together in the rebuilding of a better world after World War II. The employers and governments have long abandoned that idea since the neoliberal approach came in the 1970s and 80s, but the unions in the global north have not. They're still hoping for a seat at the table, and they're hoping for an opportunity to elevate their status as stakeholders and players in the political scene. Now, comrades, I need help closing this chat box. I don't quite know how to do it. It's getting in the way of my presentation. I'm sorry. Anyway, we'll see. So anyway, the basic view here is that there's, let me just, So this is what came out of the World Bank about 10 years ago. Remember, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the WTO had a terrible reputation, particularly in the Global South, because of its doling out austerity everywhere, structural adjustment programs. So they come up with this thing called inclusive green growth. And the idea is that they use the climate crisis as a way of saying we can reposition capitalism in a way that's fairer, more inclusive. And more recently, we have seen the narrative of what they call the Great Reset or Build Back Better, which is also coming out of the elites. And it's largely the same as it always was. It's basically about the private sector taking the lead on climate and securing profits for themselves. And we have embarrassing scenes like this, where, you know, this is the head of the International Trade Union Confederation. In white there, Sharon Burrow, very hardworking trade unionist, on the stage with anti-union forces like Richard Branson, who has openly attacked unions all over the world with Virgin Airlines. And it's, you know, it's just a bit of an embarrassment, to be honest, to see this happening. But the Paris Agreement is now, well, 6 years old, and there's been 4 or 5 COPs since then. It was basically presented as a turning point for humanity because there were so many countries that made commitments to do something about their emissions. And even though it was acknowledged at the time that their emissions levels were, what they were committing to do was not adequate, there was a belief that there was now a consensus to do something and that governments should just basically show more ambition and more political will. But what we see in the global energy system is world consumption of fossil fuels and energy continues to rise. And we see that in all forms of energy are basically expanding. So when we see the growth of renewable energy, and it's quite impressive in some parts of the world, it gives an impression that, well, you know, it may be not where we want it to be, but at least there's a lot more wind and solar now. And the wind and solar companies are the first ones to say, look how well we're doing and how cheap renewables are coming. And you have that debate in South Africa as well, that talk about the tipping point. There is no tipping point. This is not going to happen as long as you have trends like I'm showing on the screen now. Here's world oil consumption. True, COVID knocked a bit of a hole in that, but the recent data coming out in past months is that it's rebounding and big time, and there is major recovery of world oil demand. The same is true of coal. If you look at the top right there, you see a slight dip in coal, but look at the dates here, 1994 to 2018 or whatever it is, and you see a massive increase in coal consumption. It's a staggering amount of coal that's been brought into the system in the last 20, 30 years. And when the narrative says, well, coal is falling off a cliff and it's now we're in a post-coal period, it's absolute nonsense. And I urge comrades to look at the evidence, look at the facts, which is readily available. Get behind the claims and the headlines, particularly of the for-profit renewable energy sector, which are not our friends. This is renewable energy in the system. I'm going to skip this one. Here's the investment in renewable energy. Now, what we see, this is Europe. Remember, Europe was supposed to be the leader, the flagship of the world, and it did invest a lot of money. Most of it was public subsidies in the renewable energy economy, but investment has recently collapsed. It's recovered a little bit, but it's still very below what it needs to be. If Europe was, you know, the only place in town, if you like, it wouldn't be so much of a problem. But here we see in China, because of the ending of subsidies for renewables, wind and solar, there's been also a similar decline in investment. And just today, I think Dominic and I were talking about the International Energy Agency saying that renewable energy investment was at 1/3 where it needs to be in order to reach the Paris targets. So we have the targets, we have the reality. And so one of the political conclusions from this is that we cannot just go into places like Glasgow, or for that matter, Pretoria or Johannesburg and talk to leaders about showing more ambition. They've shown ambition in the targets, not adequate ambition, but more ambition is not going to solve this problem of the expansion of global energy use, and particularly in fossil fuels. Here's a good chart. You can see on the bottom right there just how little the penetration of wind and solar and other renewables in the global energy system. In the power sector, it's about wind and solar together supplies about less than 10% of global electricity supply. So we've already looked at the CO2 emissions. Now, this was October 2018. This is the head of the International Energy Agency reporting on emissions levels and saying basically he was in a state of despair, and rightly so. Now, it was mentioned by Dominic that almost 9 years ago now, the NUMSA took on this issue of social ownership of renewable energy. And since then, we did work with unions in South Africa on the just energy transition. I'm going to skip these slides and go straight, stop sharing screen and come back to you and face-to-face if you like. Let me get rid of that. So what's happening in recent years is there's an acceptance that the privatization of energy systems has actually contributed massively to the problem of not being able to address the emissions crisis. Because when you have to secure private profit for investors, the investment decisions are still in the hands of the private companies, the independent power producers and the investors behind them. In order to really plan the transition to a low carbon future, the electricity sector is going to be absolutely critical. So we cannot control emissions until we can control energy. This is not just a South Africa problem, it's a global problem. And that means demarketizing and decommodifying electricity. Because the idea of commodification of electricity is the more you sell, the more revenue you generate. This is why there's a fight between Eskom and the IPPs. You have a shrinking energy, shrinking or flatlining electricity demand, and then you've got renewables coming into the system, and there's a war between the Eskom and the IPPs. This war is going on in all of the major economies. This is not just happening in South Africa. It's happening in Europe. It's happening in North America. The energy war was basically declared by neoliberal policy because it told all energy companies that energy would no longer be a public service. It would be a commodity around which private players and those that remain in public ownership, like Eskom somewhat, would need to play the market. Now, the reason why the left unions are going to Glasgow is to say what we need, and we're going to be releasing in Glasgow, a program for a public low carbon energy future where we talk about the role of, or rather the need to reclaim large energy companies to public ownership. Now, this is more than just a question of flipping ownership from private to public, because many companies are still public, but they've been thoroughly marketized. So the reclaiming is not just an ownership reclaiming, it is a reclaiming of a mandate to the public. That is going to be crucially important. Let me just end by saying why this is so crucial. I'll use one illustration. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the International Energy Agency, everybody across the elite acknowledge that most emissions reductions will come through energy efficiency and conservation. But they have concluded that there is no viable market for energy efficiency and conservation. This is absolutely ludicrous. A public goods model done through a decommodified model would mean that utilities like Eskom would not be struggling for market share in a declining energy market, but would actually be involved in public works programs of basically conserving energy at the end use level, yes, involving communities, yes, involving municipalities, but in the terms of an energy reduction agenda, which would create a lot of jobs. Then there's the issues of the deployment of technologies, which at the moment are privately owned, but they could be publicly owned too. So you have battery storage, you have what they call distributed energy resources. This is all kind of technical stuff, but it's important to engage at this technical level in order to see a way out of the crisis. But public energy is going to be absolutely crucial. Now, I know what was said earlier about the corruption of Eskom, and you know there are 100 Escoms that you could point to similar levels of corruption, but it's not because they are public. It's because they basically have been, you know, the public sector has been attacked. There's a culture of corruption across public and private, all across the elite. There is a nihilistic, hedonistic approach to the world, where it's basically we'll take ours and after us the deluge, right? So that's, I think, the question we're confronting. Now, I will conclude with one point. I think the issues that were raised about the technical challenges of 100% renewable have to be taken seriously. It's not true that places like Europe, which has about 20% or so penetration of renewable energy, have solved the problem of variable power. It's not true. What we have in Europe is a very, very fierce debate going on about among engineers and scientists, as well as other actors in society, about whether the variability of power can be solved by batteries, by grid expansion, or by what they call changing demand to meet supply, what they call flexible demand response. And there's a big debate about it, and that debate should be happening in a more robust and consistent way in South Africa. Don't believe everything you read about, oh, we got a lot of sun and we got a lot of wind. Yes, there's going to be a big role for renewables in the future, but there are other dimensions to decarbonization that need to be addressed. So this is an appeal. Let's try to raise our understanding of these technical questions. I've seen it happen across the movement in the last several years, that there's more of a willingness to engage in some of these challenges, that there are no easy solutions to getting off of fossil fuels. It's more than just about putting up some wind and solar panels. And in the case of South Africa, it is extremely challenging to preserve energy self-determination and go down at this moment a renewable energy pathway where all of the technologies, and this is something Alex referred to, all of the technologies, all of the intellectual property are in the hands of foreign countries, and only a few of them. So we need to talk about and take to the international stage, and that would include Glasgow, a call for a new multilateralism, a global public goods approach. We've seen those calls come out in the case of the pandemic, and it should come out in the case of climate. So I urge you, if you can't be in Glasgow, we will be organizing hybrid meetings there. Join us in those debates, be part of this pro-public pathway solution, and understand that we can no longer just assume that the transition is going to take place, and our job is to get a seat at the table and protect some workers. It's a much bigger societal transition that's needed. So I'm going to stop there, and I appreciate you inviting me to make these comments.
Thank you so much, Sean. Very rich input for us. I think I'll ask comrades, they can be posting their questions if they have any, but I wanted to just raise some points from your presentation and ask a question. The key aspects for me, one of them you mentioned is decommodification. And I think we've been seeing, it reminded me of the struggle we've had in this country and all over the world against water and the commodification of water. And it's a public good, it's an obvious public good, but the system of capital creates, and it's very elastic, so it creates many ways to turn it into a commodity, to alienate it from human beings, from their needs, and create commodities so that it can use it for its own purposes, just like it uses various elements of the earth and human beings as commodities. So the decommodification position is completely and utterly vital to the struggle, but it also reminds me that the playing field, if you will, is set by bosses. It is set by a capitalist system. The struggle in the workplace is against that system. The struggle against what we are now finding in the climate crisis, the Achilles heel, as you called it, is against that system. And it has to be both an overthrow of that system, but also a transition towards it. So I think those are incredibly valuable points. And I think the step you are taking to both make the inputs at COP26 and also the real engagements on the ground with communities in struggle, who are the ones at the grassroots level facing these challenges, are very, very important to have those perspectives be shifted up. So thank you for those inputs. I just wanted to double check the chat. What I would like to, I see a hand from Alex. I did have a question just before I hand over to you, Alex, which is where in how you are approaching the renewables and also the energy crisis we are facing, wherein does nuclear power fit, and the position that you as the trade unions for energy democracy have against nuclear power? I think that's a question worth answering as well. Thank you. I'll hand over to Alex and then we can come back to you, Sean. Thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. It's just a quick question, Sean. Thanks for a great presentation. I think it's in your Eskom Transformed report that talk about the example of how, with regards to AIDS, we fought against the intellectual property regime there in South Africa, and how we could try to do something similar with regards to renewable energy. And I was just wondering if you have sort of a sense of where things are in that struggle and what paths there are to do that more, and if there are people that are already taking that fight forward. Thanks, Sean.
Should I come back, Matthew, or are there other questions you want to take now?
1 second. Just looking. Okay. There is a third question just coming from Trevor Ngwane, which I'll just read out, and then I'll hand over to you, Sean. He says, in South Africa, the working class is bearing the brunt of the energy crisis, load shedding, power failures, poor maintenance, price rises and such. And he says private solutions take the form of small petrol generators, solar panels, paraffin, etc. How can this dynamic be channeled towards collective ownership renewals? That's the third question for you. I'll hand over to you. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, comrades. How bad is that noise, by the way? I just don't know how you can hear it. There's a drilling going on next door to this apartment.
It's fine for now. It's fine for now.
Fine for now. Let me start with the nuclear question. I think a sort of a socialist trade union approach would be, let's have our own. Let's not take any technologies or any methods off the table until they've been really carefully assessed. And the environmental narrative, the environmental movements narrative around nuclear is very flawed in many respects, but so is the pro-nuclear arguments. I think we need all of the technologies need to be up for consideration. Obviously, nuclear brings certain advantages. It's small space, it generates a lot of electricity, and it's 24 hours a day. The problems we see, of course, I'm not too convinced that the waste is a big problem when you think about in the context of the climate emergency. I think it's a manageable problem, but I also believe that the fact that the nuclear technology companies are only in a few countries, Russia, China, United States, the technological leaders are largely in the US and France, and there's very little new nuclear being built, about maybe something like 50 gigawatts is being under construction. That doesn't mean to say it can't be built. But I think the problems of variability are also a very big challenge. The IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, is saying to reach 1.5 degrees would need 24,000 gigawatts of wind and solar. That is a lot of raw materials, a lot of minerals. That's a lot of space. And for basically, still would have some problems of variability. So I think there are challenges that decarbonization of electricity and the economy are just basically going to have to confront major technical challenges, and the more we understand them, the better. So I would say let's keep it on the table and interrogate some of the ideas of the past that was about these different technologies, including wind and solar and nuclear. But you were right, Matthew. we can have principles, but unless we have transitional strategies, we're not going to be taken seriously. And working class people they need electricity. It's basically an essential need in a modern economy to have a source of electricity. So we have to try to pull comrades everywhere in the working class into the discussions. One of the things I would warn against is the idea, if we talk about decommodification, is most community energy projects in the world today, which it did take off in Europe for a period, but is in really sharp decline now, is because the subsidies were removed. So the subsidies for rooftop solar, for example, in Europe were taken away because those paying for the subsidies were other users, including poor people who don't own property, who don't have farms, who, basically under the kind of cosh of landlords. They were the ones who they were seeing it on their electricity bill, and there was a pushback. It was an expensive way of doing it, of doing renewables. When the subsidies were scaled back, they were called the feed-in tariff. We saw a complete collapse in community energy projects. Because if it's based on commodification, in other words, selling electricity into the grid to make some money, that is not the way to do distributed generation or rooftop solar, for example. An alternative working class way of doing it is to say, let's assess the potential distributed generation in sunny environments like South Africa. How can we have a public program to install solar where it's needed, but not put all our eggs in one basket when we know that the sun isn't going to be shining at 3 o'clock in the morning? We need other forms of power. And so we need to address that fundamental technical challenge. But the best way of doing it is through social ownership and based on a public goods basis. That would also require insourcing manufacturing capacity. That can be done. Making solar panels, I'm sorry, it's not rocket science. And even wind turbines, the only complexities around it are some of the blades, some of the bigger blades are complex engineering accomplishments, and the generators. But other than that, it's concrete and metal and bits, components, which could be sourced internally in South Africa. So I think we need that transitional approach to it. On intellectual property, and this sort of is the last point that Alex raised, I think the demand of the elites in the world recognize that intellectual property not going to the south is a problem, because there won't be sufficient industrial capacity at the highest level of technology in order to address the climate crisis. They recognize that problem. There's a strong lobby from those who have the patents to keep it that way, to keep control over the intellectual property, even though it was publicly funded in many instances. The problem with the current narrative, though, is that if we just say, well, intellectual property needs to be loosened up and become in the hands of the business elite in China, India, the Philippines, wherever it may be, we'll just end up with basically other companies using the intellectual property to try to push out the dominance of the North-based multinationals. That's not a solution either. So global public goods approach to intellectual property is what's going to need to be instituted at the multilateral level in the coming years. Otherwise, there will not be the kind of development of those technologies that we need. And it has to be done, I think, through government agencies. As difficult as that is to imagine, given the context of South Africa and many other states, we have to have that vision that we can reclaim to public ownership and public control key technologies and key industries in order to serve the social and ecological need. I know I didn't get to Trevor's question very well, but I acknowledge the problem that if people are left to their own devices, they will do whatever they can to get energy. And if that means paraffin or diesel or whatever it will be, they're going to do it. And probably those who can afford it will do it faster and probably make some money on it along the way. So I've over-talked. I'm going to stop and go back to the chair, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Sean. I think you addressed most of those questions very, very well. But sure, it's very difficult to fill them in every single part of it. I would like to just make sure before I move to say a few points and then hand over to Sikho for beginning the closing proceedings. Do any of the NOBs who are on the call have any questions for any for Enos or for Sean for this panel? Just want to double check. Okay. I think thank you to the two presenters in this panel. I do want to emphasize for those who have joined subsequently that the recordings and the presentations that we get sent will be made available after this political school. I also want to again give my thanks to every single panelist that gave inputs and agreed to come onto our political school. And we have our NOBs that are on our national office bearers, for those who don't know, on our call. We also have some of our NEC members who have attended. And I'm sure most of these, or all of these inputs will be taken to heart and right into SAFTU, and our affiliates will keep us retained on these challenges. I would also like to suggest that a really more active partnership with the trade unions for energy democracy will be very fulfilling and fruitful for SAFTU, and I'm sure for us as a federation to you as well in the fight against climate change. I just want to double check the chat and all. I've covered everything. Okay. Before I hand over to Sikho, just a big thank you for SAFTU's leadership and enriching the debate as we've been leading up to this political school. I think we've arrived at some really practical solutions from all our participants, our panelists. And I think that a big thank you is owed to our partners at Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung for making this political school as our partner possible, for joining us together, and also especially for all of the tireless work of the staff at RLS, especially Sikho. So we thank you for that. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Sikho. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. It's also been a pleasure. I'd like to first introduce myself, I guess, quickly. I am Sikho, and I am the program manager for labor relations and economy at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung. And Matthew, I would also like to thank our partner organization, SAFTU, Vavi, and the NOBs for making the discussion possible for today. And of course, to especially thank the panelists for their presentations. Just to provide context for today, is that we are having or running at least recurring political schools from now on with our partner organization, SAFTU. And I think Comrade Enos also took the words right out of my mouth in terms of what the aim of the political schools are. And this is basically the aim is to strengthen the voice of trade unions, to further engage in the political arena, but to also take it a step further by creating a platform to publicly engage ideas together with civil society organizations, communities, precarious workers, the youth, and marginalized groups. It's especially pertinent to do so in the South African context, in a changing labor movement context, to strengthen new trade union organizational forms and to broaden class movements to achieve socio-ecological transformation. And in addition, it is also very important to do so in the context of a rising national unemployment rate, currently at 34.7% in the second quarter of 2021, as reported by Stats SA. And I think today we managed to achieve the first of many of such engagements. And in this context, today's topic was especially relevant because climate change and the just transition brings to the fore many questions relating to the labor movement, but also questions for communities, for women, and for the next generation, just to name a few. And whilst understanding that labor and its future is a crucial aspect of a just transition that focuses only on workforce-related questions, but fails to consider the entire economy, will not be able to address pressing climate-related and broader ecological concerns. And at the same time, a just transition without the support of workers may become a double-edged sword if it ignores the possible impact on workers in key industries and in certain contexts, as in the Global South. With that said, I think I will now hand over to Mac Shavalala, who's the SAFTU president, who will close the session for us today. That's if he's still online. Yes, he is.
Thank you very much, Sikho, and greetings to all panel members and presenters who agreed to join us today in our very first political workshop. And thanks also to you, Sikho, on behalf of Rosa-Luxemburg, for really supporting this initiative. We are proud to be partnering with you in dealing with these important topics. Thanks to the facilitators, Matthew, Ferrial, and Trevor. You did very well. And to our presenters, starting with the General Secretary of the Federation, his opening remarks, Professor Bond, who always, when we invite him, is available to assist us in putting context to everything that we are dealing with as a federation. Thanks to Ted as well. Dominic, Alex, Sean, Comrade Enos, who is also a fellow commissioner at the Commission for Climate Change in South Africa. Thank you very much, and all the NEC members who managed to attend, and all the interested parties. We really thank you very much. I'm aware that time is no longer on our side. Just few things as we close. The first is that just as we are sitting here today, the South African Commission on Climate Change was having a meeting that is looking at strategies in terms of financing the just transition. Now, we know that in South Africa, when we talk about finance, it's in the main government, talking about how they believe the just transition in South Africa should be funded. You don't find the private sector participating in these initiatives, which is something that is really of a concern and must be of a concern to all of us, because you will expect them to be leading in ensuring that the just transition plan is funded and funded adequately. But we know and understand as a federation that the private sector in this country has been on an investment strike for a very, very long time. So we are not surprised when they are not even pitching up when meetings that are supposed to look at the funding of the just transition in South Africa, when such meetings are convened and they are not. The second point that I want to make is the fact that if you look at the Paris agreement, the spirit of the agreement in the main really has never been about developing countries funding for the green energy initiatives and all that. It has always been about the developed countries assisting developing countries, both in terms of technology, in terms of finance and other means. It has always been like that. Why am I raising this point? I'm raising this point because where we are now as a country, we are at a point where this process of energy transition is being rushed and it is moving at a very fast pace to an extent that even the just transition that we're talking about is at risk because people are in a hurry, government is in a hurry, and the focus is in 2026. So you cannot have a country that basically wants to rush this transition, overlooking almost all the challenges that the people of South Africa are faced with. So that's one of the challenges that we are dealing with at the moment, and we think that as a federation and all the organizations that we are working with in this space must understand that there's a risk in rushing everything, especially when you are developing a country like South Africa. The third point that I want to make is that our view in terms of this meeting really has never been about, coming here and listening to best solutions or not best solutions. Our view has always been to come here really and listen to all the presentations and to basically assess which ones of those presentations speak directly to the mandate of the Federation SAFTU on this question of climate change. Because we do have a clear mandate as a federation in terms of how do we approach, how do we deal with the whole question of climate change mandated by the launching Congress of the Federation. So ours really is to take the best out of everything that has been presented and mirror it against what our mandate is all about in taking or in dealing with this issue of climate change. Of course, we are clear that climate change is a reality and that it must be addressed. But climate change cannot be addressed at the expense of, job losses. Any just transition, in our view, which is not going to speak to, unemployment, inequality, and poverty in South Africa, is not going to really receive our support. In other words, we are saying any just transition that is going to emerge from South Africa, it must be a product of the real challenges that our people in South Africa, especially the working class and the poor, are confronted with on a daily basis. We are also clear that the climate change is basically a human generated pandemic, just like the COVID virus. The only difference is that COVID kills you now, but climate change gives you a bit of space to live, but it will eventually kill you. So we are treating all these pandemics, equally. And I think as a federation, we really would like to appreciate the presentations that we were given since this morning. And we are clear that obviously climate change is a product of capitalism, and hence our view that it must be funded by capitalists and the ruling elite. So we are not, as a federation, confused when it comes to who must then fund, but we are also clear in terms of issues of ownership and control of renewable energy, which I cannot go back to. A lot was said about that, which we believe it is in line with our mandate as a federation as we deal with this issue of climate change. So we are also saying that developing countries, like ours, cannot, afford to adopt a one-size-fits-all type of an energy system. We are in support of an energy mix, and an energy mix that is informed by the country's economic realities. You will agree with me that as we speak, you have an ESCOM that cannot keep the lights on every day. There are backlogs in terms of electrification, whether you are talking about rural villages and schools and so on. But we are also having high unemployment and poverty. So those realities must be factored in as we engage, on the just transition. So that whatever plan that is going to come out, it's a plan that is informed by the realities that as a country we are faced with. So it is important to understand that that's the view, that's the approach, that's the position of SAFTU as a federation. Now, the financial assistance from developed countries, our view is that it cannot be a financial assistance that comes in the form of loans. It must be a financial assistance that is really, provided in the form of a grant to countries that are developing, so that they are able to mitigate, the climate change challenges. Imagine a country like ours, where the debt GDP ratio is hovering around I think 80% plus. And you still hear Eskom wanting something like 14 billion just for battery storage from the World Bank, and 400 billion for infrastructure development. Where is that at the end of the day, if that is provided as part of the loan, going to leave our country? So we are clear that I think we cannot allow or afford as a developing country to be further drowned into loans when it is clear that, you know, it is developing countries or developed countries that are supposed to assist developing countries in ensuring that those countries are able to play their part in responding to this question of climate change. Reality is that there are lots of jobs that are going to be lost as a result of this transition, and we are worried about that as a federation. And we are not only worried about that, we are also worried about, you know, the upskilling of the current workforce across sectors of the economy. Because what climate change is bringing, it's a complete reset of the global economy as we know it today. So you will need a new set of skills going forward if you are, you know, to respond positively to the new world of work. We do not see the public sector playing their role in that space, in ensuring that we transit with a workforce that is going to, you know, respond positively to these challenges. So that's one area that we are really worried about. Comrade Mbodi would have said something about job losses and so on and so on. For example, if you are to close or take out a power station in the grid that, you know, supply about 5,000 megawatt, and there are going to be job losses in that power station. It's not only jobs that are, you know, going to be lost in that power station. There are also jobs that you are going to lose along the value chain. And such things, as we deal with the just transition, must be taken into consideration. So that you don't have a situation where you lose high number of jobs, and then you don't create the same number or more of jobs. That imbalance, I think, is something that is going to take the country, that's going to take us back. And as a federation, I think that's the space that we are focusing as to how is that area going to be managed. So that's the other issue. We are also worried about what we call sectoral just transitions. We have a situation in the country where sectors are allowed by government to basically, you know, develop their own just transition. You're going to have a situation where all the sectors will develop their own just transition. You've got Eskom now. You're going to have a mining just transition. You'll be having a social not long. You may have a manufacturing just transition plan. And we think that government is doing this deliberately just to, you know, short circuit the approach towards a national just transition that is going to govern the country and all the sectors as a whole. So we are challenging that, and because we don't believe that as a country we need to have sectoral just transitions, because we don't know who are they consulting on the other side. So that's one thing that we think that it must be corrected. We are raising this, and we have raised this also with the chairperson, the deputy chairperson, Valumu Musa of the Commission, because we think that if government is to be allowed to move ahead and to run with this kind of an approach, it's going to create big problems going forward. It's going to create big problems going forward, even to government itself. So we are for a just transition plan, one just transition plan for the country, not these shallow transitions as mentioned by one of our presenters. So we are aware also as a federation that we are entering a new space, which will obviously need us as trade unions to basically look at how we do things going forward. The reality is that there's no single trade union that can survive without workers. And workers, we're talking membership here. So if jobs are to be destroyed and replaced by machines and all that, that will present a serious problem to the trade union or trade union movements, not only here at home, but globally. So it is important that as trade unions, we fight for permanent employment, we fight for, not just jobs, but sustainable jobs as we transit. We must also make sure that, in the process, we deal with the question of absence of trade unions in platforms where key decisions are taken. Because most of the things or the issues that are being discussed now, most of the trade unions are not consulted on. For example, you will have in South Africa a situation where SAFTU is excluded from NEDLAC, where consultations on these matters and others are taking place. So it must be clear that anyone who would come up with a plan and say this is a plan that was communicated, that was consulted, and that it represents the views of the working class and the poor people in South Africa, it must be clear that that will be a plan which does not or will not represent us as a federation. But the other issue that I think we'll have to deal with is, and this is specific in the energy sector, we have a looming job bloodbath in Eskom, in the mining, and the manufacturing sector, as a result of the climate change approach. Now, it will be very important that that situation be managed by trade unions, but also ensure that the fragmentation of labor movements you know, becomes a thing of the past, because we are faced with one challenge as a trade union movement. Whether you are COSATU or FEDUSA or SAFTU, but the challenge that is facing the workers under your leadership is the same. And that's why, as a federation, we took an approach that says, when it comes to worker issues, we'll have to make sure that we unite workers across, you know, sectors, and irrespective of where those workers are employed. So we'll need to be solid when it comes to this area, and we will then appeal, you know, with all the organizations that are working with us to understand that, you know, what we are faced with now in ESCOM, in the mining sector, and the manufacturing sector, it's a very, very serious situation that is threatening not only employment, but, you know, the livelihoods of ordinary South Africans. We are in a situation where each South African or South African worker is supporting no less than 10 people in a family. So this is one of those situations that must be properly managed. So as I conclude, allow me to once again thank you, Rosa-Luxemburg, presenters, and all the panel members for really making sure that this workshop become a success. We are looking forward to meet our international friends and comrades in COP26 and to share with them the challenges that we are faced with here at home, and the challenges that are facing Africa as a continent. And together we'd like to join hands and fight for what we call in South Africa, the people's just transition. Thank you very much, Comrade Matt. I'm not sure whether I'll have to hand over to you, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade President, for your closing remarks. I think we can bring the session to an end. And again, thank you to everyone. Thank you.